and welcome to this crash video on Python programming. Now in this video you will get to know each and every piece of information that is basically needed to get started with Python programming language. Now Python, according to many sources, is the world's most popular programming language, and also it is the fastest growing programming language as well. And the reason for it is because it is very flexible, very beginners friendly, and you don't have to write very lengthy code to perform your task. And another most important reason for its popularity is that you can use it to perform anything. You can use it to build desktop and mobile applications. You can do system programming with it. You can use it for web applications, and most popular use of Python programming is machine learning. You can train any machine learning model in Python programming language very easily. Okay, so all about Python, and now let's get started with the coding part in Python. Alright, now the first thing you're gonna need to do is to have Python installed on your machine. So first of all, you need to download Python. So to download it, open your internet browser that you have and go to this website python.org/downloads. Now in here you need to download the latest version of Python, which is 3.8.5. Now make sure you have Python 3, which is the latest version, and we're going to be using it in this course as well, because Python 2 Python 2 point something is not used a lot anymore, and officially it is not properly managed by the developers of Python programming language. So download Python 3. So I'm not going to download it because I already have downloaded it in my computer, but in your case, if Python is not installed on your computer, then make sure that you click on this download button to download Python. And once you have successfully downloaded it, go to the download section in your computer and start installing Python in your computer. It is actually a very simple process. Just click next couple of times and it will be successfully installed. So once you have successfully installed Python, then you can start writing your Python code directly from your command line or terminal. But that will be a lot difficult and tedious. So what you're going to do is that you're going to install an IDE or integrated development environment, where writing in your code will be at least 8,000 times more easier than writing your Python code in command line or terminal. Now you can choose any IDE like Visual Studio, Sublime, or even Notepad, but the one I'm going to be using is called PyCharm. So if you also want to use PyCharm, go to this website which is jetbrains.com/python/download, and then a hash section equal to, well, depending upon your operating system. So if you're using Windows, just click on this tab Windows, and if you're using Mac, just click on this Mac option, and then if you're using Linux, then click on this Linux option. Now in here, since I'm using Windows, so I'm gonna just click on this tab Windows. Now you can see that there are two types of PyCharms. There are two versions of PyCharm available. The one is basically the professional version, which is paid, and then the other one is the community version, which is absolutely free of cost. So just click on this free option, just click on this download button, because the community version is free of cost. So just click on this download button and it will start downloading PyCharm on your computer. So it's basically a lengthy file, so it will take time to download it, but I'm not going to click on this download button because I already have downloaded PyCharm on my computer. But in your case, if PyCharm is not installed on your computer, then make sure that you click on this download button to start downloading PyCharm on your computer. Now I'm going to be using the professional version of PyCharm, but anything that you will do with the professional version can also be done with the community version that we're going to be covering in this course. So I'm going to be using the professional version, but you can feel free to choose the community version. It is exactly like same as the professional version. Well, I'm using the professional version because I have to do some web development task with Python, but in your case you need to click on this download button, because anything that we will do with this professional version can also be done with this community version. So once you have successfully downloaded PyCharm, just go to the download section where you have downloaded it, and just start installing PyCharm on your computer. So again, it is a very simple process. Just click next a couple of times and it will be installed on your computer in few minutes. So once you have successfully installed PyCharm on your computer, then you can just search here on your computer. You can just search for PyCharm, and in here, once you open PyCharm, you should be able to see this screen. So I'm using this professional version, but your screen might be a little different from mine. but the basic idea is exactly the same. Now, first of all, what you're gonna do is that you need to create a project. So just click on this file option and just click on this option, new project. Now in here, since you are creating a new project, so just name your project. So in here, just choose any location where you want to create your project, and then in here you can name your project. So let's say that I will just name it as Python crash course. Well, you can name it anything you want, and then click on this create option, and it will create this project inside that location that you have chosen. So I'm not going to create this project because I already have created one project named Python tutorials. Well, you can click on this create option if you don't have any project created so far. So I'm just gonna close it, and once you just created that project, then you should be able to see basically the name of your project right here. So I name my project as Python tutorial, and then in here just click on this option project, and now what you're gonna do is that you basically need to create a file, basically a Python file inside this project. So just right click on this project and then just click new, and we're gonna create a Python file, and I'm gonna name this Python file as, let's say, crash video, and then just create a Python file, and it will basically create a Python file. Alright, so here we have this file. So it is basically inside my Python tutorials, and I named that file as crashvideo.py. Now in here, inside this file, we can start writing Python code. So yeah, that's it for this video. From the next video, we will start writing Python code. So I hope that you will successfully install Python and PyCharm on your computer. But still, if you have any issue installing it, then just feel free to contact me through email, and I will definitely get back to you as soon as I can. So yeah, that's it for this installation part. Okay, so once you have your IDE and Python project set up, we can now move on to write our very first Python program, and we're gonna simply print something out on the console screen. Now, what is a Python console screen? Well, if you're using PyCharm, then you should be able to see this tab which says Python console right here. So just click on this tab, Python console, and here we have the Python console screen. Now, what is this Python console screen? Well, Python console screen is basically a screen which in most cases shows the result of your Python program, or it basically shows whatever we want to print on the screen. So let's say that we want to print something out on this console screen. Now, in order to print something out on this console screen, we're gonna use a statement or command in Python called print. So right here, I will just type print, and now I will have this opening and closing round bracket, and now inside either single or double quotation mark, I can type anything that I want to print on the console screen. So let's say I want to print, let's say I am here. Alright, so now in order to execute this whole file which says Python crashcourse.py, I'm gonna click on this option run, and now in here just click on this run option, and now let's say that you want to run basically this file Python crash course. So just click on this option Python crash course, and here we have the result of our Python program. It basically print out basically this thing right here on this console screen. Now we can print out something else, like let's say I have 5 pets, and now if I just execute this file once again, and now this time you will see that I have this result on my console screen. Now we have used this statement only one time. Well, if I just use it 5 times, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and now if I just execute this whole code, you're gonna see basically this thing 5 times right here on this console screen. So this is what basically a print statement do, and this is what basically a console screen is. So a Python console screen is basically a screen which basically shows whatever we want to print on the screen. So yeah, that's it for this print statement. Now we're gonna introduce another very important concept of Python called variables. Now variable is like a container that contains or holds something. So for example, instead of printing this thing, something like this, what I can do is that I can create a variable or container and then store basically this whole thing in that container or variable, and then print out that variable. So in here, for example, I'm gonna create my variable. Well, you can name your variable anything you want, but let's say I will name my variable as a, but you can name your variable something like abc, or let's say xyz, or you can just name it to like x5 or or anything you want. But remember that the variable name must not start from a number. Like you cannot name your variable like 5v or only 5 or let's say 5xyz or something like this. So let's say that I will name my variable as a, and now I will just assign or store some value inside that variable using this assignment operator equal. And now since I have this variable, I can now store anything in that variable. So let's say I want to store basically this thing in that variable. So I will just cut it from here and we'll paste it right here. Alright, so now I have that variable or container which basically contains this thing. And now if I just print out this variable, so just type print a and now execute this whole code, you will see the same result as we have previously. And now if I just print this variable 5 times or let's say 3 times, I'm gonna see this thing 3 times on my console screen. Alright, so now let's say I will just create another variable, and this time I will name this variable as b, and I will put it equal to, let's say, I am a new variable. And now let's say I will just print this variable b as well. So just remove this line of code from here, and now let's execute this whole code. Alright, so first of all, it prints out whatever we have in the first variable, because this variable is printed before this variable, and then we have the result of this variable that we are seeing right here on this console screen. So basically in here I'm putting this variable equal to a string. Now what is a string? Now string can be anything which is enclosed in single or double quotation mark. So notice here that I'm not telling Python that I'm going to have a string in that variable. Python is actually a very smart language. It knows that it is basically a string. Now similarly, if I just try to store some numbers in that variable, so let's say that now this variable will be equal to some numeric value, and this will be equal to 31. Now remember that numeric values are not enclosed in either single or double quotation mark. If you just enclose this value 31 in single or double quotation mark, then it will not be a numeric value. It will then be basically, Python will just treat it as a string. So remember that numeric values are not enclosed in either single or double quotation mark. Alright, and now let's say that I will just print out this variable a on the console screen. So just simply execute this whole code once again, and this time you will see this number right here on my console screen. Now similarly, we can just store some decimal value in a variable. So let's say that I will have a new variable, and I will name this variable as c, and let's say that this time it will contain some floating decimal value, and this will be like 41.7834 and so on. And now if we just print out this variable c as well, so just execute this whole code and you will see the result of this variable c right here on my console screen. Alright, now you can basically create variables something like this as well. So for example, I want to create two variables. Now I can create it something like this. So a comma b, and this basically means that I have two variables that are separated by this comma. Now this comma basically tells that these are basically two variables and not one variable. And now if you just declare it something like this, ab, now Python will treat it as a single variable which contains this value 31. But if I just put this comma here, Python now knows that this is not basically one variable, these are two variables, a and b. So now a contains this value 31, and now we need to assign some value to b as well. So let's say that b contains 45. And now similarly, we can just print out result like this as well, like print a comma b. And now if you just execute this whole code, you will see the values of variable a and b right here on my console screen. Now similarly, we can have a third variable as well, so abc, and now let's say that we will have some string value, and that is, let's say, apple. And now we can just add this variable right here as well. And now if we just execute this whole code, so first of all it prints out 31 because we have variable a at first, and then variable b because we have variable b at second position, and then we have variable c because we have variable c right here at the third position. So yeah, that's all for variables. Now we're gonna cover more about variables in the future as we move on in this crash course. Okay, now let's move on to perform something real in Python. So what we're gonna do is that we will make a very basic calculator in Python which will be able to perform some arithmetic operations like addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and also the modulus operation. So let's say I want to add two numbers and then print out the result on the console screen as well. So for this we need to use the print statement. So I will say that print, and let's say that we want to add two numbers 5 and 8. So 5, and then we need to use this plus symbol to perform addition between two numbers, and these two numbers are 5 and 8. So it will basically add these two numbers 5 and 8, and then we'll print out the result on the console screen. So just execute this whole code and you will see 13 on the console screen. Alright, now similarly we can perform a subtraction between these two variables. So I will say that 5 minus 8, and you will see the result -3 on the console screen. Now similarly we can add more than two numbers. So for example we will say that 5 plus 8 plus 9 plus 5, and now if you just execute this whole code and you will see the result, which is 27. Alright, now similarly we can do something like 5 plus 8 minus 9, and then minus 5 plus 13, and now if you just execute this whole code you will see the result, which is 12. Alright, now similarly we can perform multiplication as well. So just type here 5 multiplied by 6, and so make sure that for multiplication you use this static symbol. So now if you just execute this whole code you will see that 30, you will see 30 on the console screen. Now instead of performing arithmetic operation like this, what we can do is that we can basically create variables and then store some numeric values in it and then perform arithmetic operations using these variables. So in here, let's say that I will just create two variables, and my first variable will contain a numeric value 6, and my second variable will be, let's say, 12. My second variable will contain this value 12. And now what I can do is that I will say that print A plus B, and now if you just execute this whole code you will see the result 18 on the console screen. And now similarly what I can do is that I will say that B divided by A, so B divided by A, and just execute this whole code and you will see this result 2 on the console screen, 2.0. Alright, and now well you can do something like this as well. So just create another variable C and just type here C equal to now B divided by A, and now just execute and now just print out this variable C, which basically contains the result after dividing B by A. So just execute this whole code and again you will see the same result, which is 2. Now similarly you can perform the modulus operation between you can perform the modulus operation as well. So let's say that I will have this variable which contains this value 13, and now what I can do is that I will just create this variable C and I will say that B divided by A. So now if it is execute on this code you will see the result 1 on the oops, we are again performing the division operation. So basically we need to perform the modulus operation. So to perform the modulus operation we use this percentage sign here. So now if you just execute this whole code you will see the result this time 1 on the console screen. Now what is basically this modulus operation? So modulus operation basically give you the remainder after dividing these two numbers. So 13 divided by 6 we have the remainder of 1, so it just give the result 1. Alright, now similarly we can perform some complex expression, something like this. Like for example we will have like couple of variables. So let's say this variable contain this value 3, and then we will have another variable D, and this value this time it contains this value, let's say 11, and we will have another variable let's say E, which contain this value, let's say 5. And now similarly we can do something like A plus B minus C multiplied by D, and then minus E multiplied by A. So it basically follows the same rule as, so it basically follows the rule of PEDMAS, which basically stands for parentheses and then exponent, division, multiplication, addition, and subtraction. So first of all it will execute this parentheses, the innermost parentheses. So first of all it will multiply C by D, and then it will then perform an exponential, and then it will perform basically division and multiplication. So in here first of all it will just multiply E multiplied by A, and then it will add A plus B, and then it will just print out this result. Alright, so now if you just execute this whole code you will see basically the result of this expression, which is negative 44. So this is how we can perform arithmetic operations in Python. Okay, now I'm going to talk more about strings in Python. So in here, I'm going to create a variable and I will name this variable as a and I will put it equal to a string. So basically anything that I will type inside this single or double quotation mark will be basically a string. So let's say that the string will be I am here on the console screen. Alright, now here we have this string, and now let's say instead of printing out this whole string, what I want is that let's say I only want to print out only a specific character from this string. So let's say I only want to print out this character H from this string on the console screen. So remember that each character inside this string has an index number. An index number in Python and almost all the programming languages always start from 0. So this first character, which is basically capital I, is at index number 0, and then this space is at index number 1, and then this small a is at index number 2, and then this m is at index number 3, and then 4. So this h is at index number 5. So what I'm going to do is that I will just say print and then basically the name of this variable in which we have this character, and then we in here inside the square bracket we need to specify the index number of that character that we want to print out on the console screen. So in this case this h is at index number 5, so I will just type here 5. Alright, so now if I just execute this code, you will only see this character H on the console screen. And now let's say that I want to print out, let's say, this character O on the console screen. So this O is at basically this O is basically at index number, so 6, 7, 8, 9 and 10. So in here we need to specify the index number of that character that we want to print out on the console screen. So in this case this small o is at index number 10. So now if you just execute this whole code, you will see only O printed out on the console screen. Alright, now let's say that you want to print out the last character of this string. So instead of counting on this thing starting from 0 and then all the way down to this character, what I can do is that in here I can specify -1. So basically this -1 points to the last character of the string. So now if you just execute this whole code, you will see the last character of the string printed out on the console screen, which is n. And now similarly, if I just type here -2, it will print out the second last character, which is small e on the console screen. And then similar is the case with remaining characters as well. Alright, now let's say that you will have another string, and let's say that the string will be b, and let's say that that in this string we will have I am here on the console screen and I am happy here. Alright, now let's say that you want to concatenate or basically add both of these strings. So what you can do is that in here you can use basically the concatenate symbol, which is plus and then the name of your second string, which is b. And what it will do is that it will basically add or basically concatenate this string, which is a, with this string b. So now if you just execute this whole code, you will see basically the concatenated string right here on the console screen. So remember that we cannot concatenate basically a number and a string. So for example, if this string contain any numeric value, like for example if we have 5 here, and now if you just try to concatenate a string with a numeric value, it will basically throw an error because a string cannot be concatenated with a number. So in here it is saying that it is basically a type error. So it is saying that can only concatenate a string to a string, because we can only concatenate or add a string to a string. We cannot concatenate a string with an integer. But what we can do is that we can basically put both of these things together here with this comma symbol. So now if you just execute this whole code, it will this time throw no error. So it is basically putting basically this thing and then this thing together. It is not concatenating it, but it is simply putting this variable a and then this variable b together right here on the console screen. Alright, now let's say that you want to basically convert all the characters basically inside these strings into lowercase. So in here you can see that this first character, which is capital I, is uppercase, and now let's say that we will have some other characters capital as well, like for example this T and then this L and then let's say this C as well. Alright, now let's say that you want to basically convert basically convert each and every character inside this string into lowercase. So what you can do is that in here you can basically call a function. Now I know you don't know what functions are, but let's say that you will just use this function dot lower. So just for instance, just know that this function basically contains information. Basically it knows how to convert basically any string into lowercase. So just remember that you have these two parentheses of this function. Now we will cover functions later on in this video, but for now just know that this function lower contains information of how to convert any character basically inside this string into lowercase. So now if you just execute this whole code, you will see each and every character printed out on the console screen in lowercase. Now similarly, if you want to convert all the characters inside this string into uppercase, so for this you can use the upper function in Python, and it will convert basically all the characters inside this string into uppercase. So in here you can see that all the characters are now converted into uppercase. Or now in here, let me just teach you one other thing, and that is basically a function called is upper. And now what it will do is that it will check if we have any uppercase character inside this string or not. If there is any uppercase character inside the string, it will return true, or else it will return false. So since we have some uppercase characters, that is capital I and then capital T, so it will basically return true. So now let's execute this whole code and see the result. So in here it is saying that we have false because this entire string is not in uppercase form. So now let's say that what I will do is that I will first of all convert this whole string into uppercase, and now I can basically use a combination of two functions. So first of all, what I'm doing is that I'm first of all converting this whole string into uppercase, and then I'm calling this function called is upper. So now if I just execute this whole code, this time it should return true, and you can see that this time it returns true. And now similarly we can use the lower function as well. So in here I can just call this function is lower. So it is lower. So yeah, here we have this function. Alright, so now if you just execute on this whole code, this time it will return false because this entire string is basically not in lowercase. So in here I will just again use this function we have, first of all, we need to convert this whole string into lowercase, and then we will just call this function is lower. Alright, so now if you just execute this whole code, this time it will return true. Alright, so now in here you can see that it has returned true. So basically Python has three types of data types. Two types of data type that we already have covered, that is basically a string and numbers. Now this is the third type of data type, that is basically either true or false, or we can call it as Boolean data type. So in Boolean data type we either have true or false, just like we have seen here that it is basically returning true if all the characters inside this string is lowercase, or else it will return false. Now another very cool function that we can use with string is basically len, which basically stands for length, and this len or length function basically returns the length or the number of characters that we have inside the string. So in here what I can do is that I will just type let me just select this whole thing, and now let's call this function len, and now this len basically takes that string which is a. So in here we need to pass basically this string which is a. Now this thing will basically make more sense once we cover functions later on in this video. So now if you just execute this whole code, it will basically return the total size of this string, or the length of this string, which is 31. This means that we have in total 31 characters inside this string, including the spaces. Alright, now another cool function that we can use with string is basically the index function. So now let's say that you want, if you want, for example, the index number of this character t. So for this we can use the function index. So just type here index, and now in here, we basically first of all have to call that string which is a, and then index, and now in here we need to specify that character whom index number we want to find. So in this case, we are interested in to find out the index number of this character T, capital T. So in here we need to type capital T. And now if you just execute this whole code, you will see the index number of this character T, which is 13. And now similarly, let's say you want to find out the index number of this character E. Let's say you want to find out the index number of the character E. So just type here E, and now if you just execute this whole code, it will basically return the index number of the first found character. So in this case, it has returned the index number of this character E because it is the first found index number of that character. Now similarly in here, you can just not only use single character, but you can use multiple character. Like for example, you can find out the index number of this whole character on. So just type here on and execute this whole code, and it will basically returns basically the index number of this character O, because in here in this character on we have O at first. Alright, now in here what you can do is that you can also use something like on the let's say console, or in short con. So again it will basically return the index number of the first found character, which is basically inside this string. So it will again return this value 10. Now another function that we can basically use is basically the replace function. So let's say that you want to replace this thing console, or let's say something like this this character this world the with something else. So for this you can use a replace function. So first of all, you need to specify that world that you want to replace. So let's say that we want to replace this world the. So just type here the, and now next make sure that you have this comma here, and next you need to specify what you want to replace in place of this world the. So let's say that we want something like Python. Alright, so now if you just execute this whole code, oops right here. Alright, so in here you can see that instead of the right here, we now have Python right here on the console screen. So these are some of the cool functions of string. Well, we're gonna cover more functions of string in depth once we covered functions in Python later on in this video. Alright, now I'm going to be talking about the most important topic of every programming language, known as functions. Now functions are like small modular chunks that is assigned a specific task in a program. So for example, our program is assigned, let's say 10 tasks to perform, then it's much better to have 10 functions for it. And then similarly, let's say our program is assigned let's say 100 tasks to perform, then it's much better to have 100 functions for it. So for example, we will create a program which will perform addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division between two numbers. So for this, we're going to create 4 functions. So now in order to create a function, we use this keyword def, and this keyword def basically tells Python that alright, I'm going to create a function. And now with this keyword def, Python knows that I'm going to create a function. And now we will just put a space, and now next we need to define we need to name our function. So you can name your function anything you want, but I'm going to name my function as, let's say, addition, because this function will perform addition between two numbers. And then you need to have this closing and basically this opening and closing round brackets. And basically these round brackets are basically for having some additional piece of information with this function. I'm gonna be talking more about it later on in this video. And then we basically put this colon, and then we hit enter, and now here we have, and now here our function basically begins. So basically now whatever we put inside this function must be indented. Like for example, if you just print out something here in this indented form, which basically means it is inside this function. So this is basically my indentation. So make sure that anything that you want to be the part of this function, it must be indented. So for example, if I just print out something right here like, hey, this is a function. So this is a function. So now this print statement is basically inside this function addition. But let's say if I have another print statement and it is not indented, and it is somewhere right here, basically right here, basically where we have this cursor, and then where we have this cursor. So it is basically not the part of this function. So let's say that I will say here, this is not a function. So now basically this print statement is basically the part of this function addition, because here we have identified, but this thing, this print statement, is not the part of this function addition. So anything that you want to be the part of this function, it must be identified. Alright, now this function will be basically able to perform addition between two numbers. So first of all, I will have two variables, let's say a and b. So the first variable a will be equal to 12, and the second variable b will be equal to, let's say, 6. Alright, so now we're gonna just basically print out the result. So we will just type a plus b. So now if I just execute this whole code, you will see that we will have nothing on the console screen. So you can see that our program finished without showing us anything. Now, what do you think might be the reason? Well, the reason is very simple. It's because we basically have created this function, but we haven't called this function. Now in Python or any programming language, when we create a function, we must call it as well in order to execute it. So now in order to call this function, I'm just going out of this function. So right here, I'm just calling it. So make sure that you have the same name right here that you have named your function. So in this case, we named our function addition. So I'm just calling it with this name addition, and then make sure that you have these two parentheses in order to call this function. All right, so now if you just execute this code, this time you will be able to see the result of these two numbers, which is 18. All right, so this is basically our first function. And now let's say that if I just call this function once again, so let's type here addition, and now if you just execute it, you will see that we have the result 2 times because we have called this function 2 times. Now if we just call this function, let's say 10 times, then it's gonna basically print out the result 10 times. Alright, so that was our first function, and now let's create another function, and that will be basically the subtraction function. So I'm just creating it outside this function. So let's type here def and then the subtraction function. So in here we have the subtraction function, and now I'm just coming inside the body of this subtraction function. So again, make sure that you have everything indented if you want anything to be the part of this function. So again, it will be 2 numbers, and let's say that these 2 numbers will be again the same, a and b, and this time we're just gonna say the a minus b. Alright, so now let's call this function as well in order to execute it. So just type here subtraction. So make sure again that the name here and here is exactly the same. So now if I just execute this whole code, you will first of all see the result of the addition function, which is at 18, because we have called this function addition first of all, and then similarly we have called this function subtraction. So now in here it showed the result of the subtraction. So this is basically the order of our program. It basically follows the order. First of all, we have called this function addition, so it prints out the result of the addition, and then we call the function subtraction. So after showing the result of the addition, it then shows the result of the subtraction. Alright, so now we will have another 2 functions, and that will be basically the division and multiplication function. So I'm gonna just copy this function, and I will just paste it right here. And then this time we will just name this function as multiplication, and here it will be able to perform multiplication between these 2 numbers. And then I will have another function, and that function will be, let's say, division. Alright, so this time it will be able to perform division, and now make sure that you have called this function in order to execute it. So first of all, we'll just print out the result of this function multiplication and then division. Alright, so now if you just execute this whole code, alright, so you can see that first of all, well, let me just make this thing a little more clear by just printing out, let's say, first addition function is called, and next we will have the subtraction function called. So let's say subtraction function is called, and then similarly we will have multiplication function called. So multiplication function is called, and then finally we will have the division function called. So right here I will just say div function is called. Alright, so now if you just execute this whole code, so first of all, it's gonna print out this statement addition function is called. So right here you can see that it first of all called the addition function because first of all we have basically called this function addition. So that is why it just first of all prints out the result of our addition function, and then the subtraction function is called, and then here we have the result of the subtraction, and then similarly multiplication and division. So this is how we can basically create a function in Python, and this is how we can basically execute it. Alright, now I'm going to be talking about function arguments or parameters. Now function arguments or parameters are like additional piece of information that you pass to any function while calling that function. So let's say that you want to pass some additional piece of information to this function addition that we created. So let's say that this additional piece of information will be basically these two numbers 6 and 12 that you want to add inside this function. So you can pass these two numbers 12 and 6 while calling this function. So right here we are calling this function, and now in here basically inside these two parentheses we can pass this additional piece of information. So let's say that you want to pass the two numeric values that you want to add basically inside this function addition. So we can pass it something like this. The first argument or the first piece of information that we can pass is, let's say, 12, and now the second piece of information will be 6, let's say. So make sure that you separate it by this comma. So basically here we have the first argument, and then here we have the second argument that we are passing to this function addition. Alright, now once we pass it to this function addition, now it will be received right here in these parentheses as well. So in here we will receive it, let's say, in these two variables a and b. Well, again, you can name it anything you want. Now we can basically delete it right from here because these two variables contain these values 6 and 12. And now if we just call this function again, so we will again see the same result. So now let's pass it to the subtraction and multiplication function as well. So 12 and 6, and here we have 12 and 6 and 12 and 6. And now let's delete it from here because we do not need it. So just delete it, and then just delete it, and then just delete it from here as well. So make sure that once you are passing it, it will be received right here in these two variables a and b. Well, again, you can name it anything you want, but I'm just naming it as a and b. So here, here, and then here. Alright, so now let's execute this whole code, and again you will see the same output that we were seeing previously. So first of all, we have the result of the addition function, and then the subtraction, multiplication, and division. So this is how we can basically pass some additional piece of information to any function. So this additional piece of information that we pass to a function are known as function argument or parameter. So for example, in here we are passing the first so in here we have the first parameter 12, and then in here we have the second parameter or argument, that is 6. So in here we have received it in these two variables a and b. So basically here we have two parameters a and b. So yeah, this is what function arguments or parameters are. Okay, so not only that, we can pass some additional piece of information to a function, but we can also return information from a function as well. So here we have this function addition. Now let's say that we do not want to print out the result inside this function addition. Instead, we want this function to return that result, and then we print out the result, let's say, somewhere else in our program. So in here, instead of printing this result right here, what we will do is that we will return that result. So for this, we will use this keyword return, and now we want to basically return the addition of these two numbers a and b. So what it will do is that first of all it will just add these two numbers a and b, and then we'll return that result. Or what we can do is that in here we will just create another variable c, and we'll put it equal to a plus b, and now c contain basically the result of these two, basically the addition of these two numbers a and b. And now we can also return basically simply c, which is basically the result variable. So we can do it both way. So now we are basically returning that result, but where this result will be received. So in here basically where we call that function, in here basically we call this function. So right in here that result will be received. So let's say that we would receive it, let's say, in a variable, and we'll name this variable as result addition, and we'll put it equal to this function addition. So basically we are calling this function addition, and now from this addition function, we are basically returning the result of these two numbers a and b. So it will be returned from where we call this function. So basically we call this function from right here. So here it will be received, and now we have that result in this variable result underscore add. Now we can basically print out that result anywhere else in our program. So let's say that we will print out the result right here. So we'll say that print result add, and now let's get rid of this line of code. Alright, so now if we just execute this whole code, so the addition of, so if we just add 12 and 16, we have the result 18. So we will have 18 right at the end of our result screen. So here we have the result, which is 18, which is basically inside this variable result add. Alright, so basically this is how we can basically return result from a function. Now similarly, we can do it for the remaining functions as well. So in here, we will just simply say return a minus b, and then in here we will say that return a multiplied by b, and then similarly we will say that return a divided by b. So in here we'll be calling this function. Well, we can just simply print it out something like this, print, and then this function, make sure that you have, so basically we have this print parenthesis, which is this thing, this bracket, and then this bracket, and then we have basically this function parameters, function brackets right here. So we can print it something like this just by simply printing out this whole function, because we have returned that result, and it will be basically returned, and it is basically returned from where we are calling it. So we are basically we can just directly print out this result, or we can basically store that result in a variable, and this time let's name it to result underscore sub, and put it equal to this thing, and then similarly we'll say that result underscore mul, and then similarly we will say that result underscore div, and put it equal to this thing. And now we can print out the result. So let's just get rid of these lines of code. So just get rid of this line of code, this line of code, and then this line of code. Alright, so now let's copy this line of code. So let's copy, and we'll paste it 3 more times basically. So first of all, we are basically printing out the result of addition, and then we will print out this variable result underscore sub, in which we have the result of subtraction. So result sub, and then we will just print out the result of multiplication, which is stored in this variable result underscore mul, and then just similarly result underscore div. So now let's execute this whole code. Make sure that you do not have any error. So now let's execute this whole code, and again you will see the same output right here on the console screen. Alright, so not only we can return only one piece of information, but we can return multiple pieces of information from this function as well. So let's say that this addition function will basically return the result of subtraction as well. So for this, what we can do is that we will just simply say that return the result a plus b, and then similarly we want the result a minus b as well. So we are basically returning two results, a plus b and then a minus b. So now basically we do not need this function subtraction, because this addition function is doing that job. So now if I just right here, we are just calling this function addition. Now since addition function is returning two results, that is a plus b, and then basically this comma basically means that we want to return multiple results. So let's say that you want to result 3 results, then you need another comma here as well. So since we are returning only 2 results, the addition and then the subtraction result, so right here we need 2 variables as well where we are calling this function. So now let's name this variable as result underscore sub. Alright, and now let's get rid of this line of code because we do not have any subtraction function now. Alright, so now let's, for instance, let's get rid of these 2 lines of code as well. So just simply, we now have these 2 variables, result add and then result sub. So first of all, we are returning the addition result. So it will be returning the first variable that we have right here, and then we are returning the subtraction result after the addition, after the addition result, so it will be basically received here in the second variable because we are returning it at the second position. So first of all, we are printing out the result add, and then we are just printing out the result sub. Or we can just simply do it something like this as well. Like first of all, we can print out the result of sub, and then we can print out the result of addition. But let's say that we will do it something like this. First of all, we will return print out the result of addition and then subtraction. So now let's execute this whole code, and first of all, you will see the result of addition, which is 18, and then we are seeing the result of subtraction. Now let's say that only this function will just do the whole job of multiplication and division as well. So we'll just name this function as let's say arithmetic, or let's name this function as calculator. And now this function will also perform multiplication between two numbers, and then addition and then division between these two numbers as well. So a divided by b. So we are basically returning four results: a plus b, a minus b, a multiplied by b, and then a divided by b. So in here we have four results that we are returning. So in here, so now we do not need these two functions. So basically now we just name this function as calculator. So in this calculator function, we are passing two arguments 12 and 6, and now this basically calculator function is basically returning four results. So we need four variables here as well. So the third one will be, let's say, result underscore mul, and then the fourth one will be, let's say, result underscore div. So now basically it will be received in the same order that we are returning right here. Well, let me just move it a little upper so that it can make more sense. So first of all, we are returning a plus b, so it will be received right here in this first variable, result underscore add, and then we are basically returning the a minus b, so it will be received in the second variable. So basically we are returning the first result, so it will be received in the first variable, and then the second result will be received in the second variable, and then the third one in the third variable, and so on. So now let's print out this result here as well. So let's type print this variable result underscore mul, and then just finally print underscore result underscore div. Alright, so now let's execute this whole code, and you will see the same result as you were seeing previously. So this is how we can return something from a function in Python. Okay, now let's talk about another important topic in Python, and that is list. Now, when you are making something real in Python, you actually have to deal with lots of data. So there should be something which can actually handle and manage this data, and that is a list. So we can say that list is a data structure in which we can store different items in a well-ordered sequence way. So now let's create that list. So first of all, I'm gonna name my list. So let's say I will name my list as list1. Well, again, you can name it anything you want, and this is basically a variable, or you can also call it an object in which we will basically store that list. And now we'll put it equal to basically a list. Now, in order to create a list, we need basically this opening and closing square bracket. And this basically tells Python that, all right, I'm going to create a list. So now we can insert items in that list. So we can insert numeric or string or any data type, anything inside this list. So let's say that we will insert some numeric and string data inside this list. So let's say that the first item that we have inside this list is, let's say, 3. And now let's say for the second item, we need to put this comma. And now for the second item, we will have, let's say, 7 and then 9. And then we will have some strings values as well. Like, for example, we will have apple, and then let's say we will have banana, and then let's say we will have let's say oranges, and now let's say we will have again some numeric data, like for example 1, and then let's say 9, and then let's say we will have last numeric data, and that is, let's say, grapes. Alright, so now in here we have a list, and we name this list as list1, and then we have different items in that list. Well, you can have Boolean variable inside this, or you can even have a list inside that list as well. So each item, so each value that we have inside this list is basically an item. So we have the first item, the second item, the third item, the fourth item, and so on. Now in order to print out this whole list, what you can do is that you can just simply say print and then the name of this list, which is list 1. So now if you just execute this whole code, you will basically see this whole list printed out right here on this console screen. Now let's say that you only want to access specific items from this list. So let's say that you want to access, let's say, this item banana from this list. Now remember that items in a list is stored by their index number. So the first item is at index number 0 because indexes in Python and almost every programming language always start from 0. So this first item is at index number 0, the second item is at index number 1, this third item is at index number 2, and then this fourth item is at index number 3, and so on. So now let's say that you want to access this item banana, so it is at index number 0, 1, 2, 3, and then 4. So it is basically the fifth item, but it is at index number 4. So first of all, we need to type the name of the list in which we have this item banana, and then inside this square bracket we need to type the index number of that item that we want to access, basically that we want to print out. So let's say that it is basically this item banana, and this banana item is at index 4. So just type here 4, and now let's execute this whole code, and it will print out this item banana right here on the console screen. And then similarly, let's say that you want to access the, let's say, this oranges item, so it is at index number 5, and now let's execute this whole code, and it will print out oranges on the console screen. Now let's say that you want to access the last item, so basically the last item is at index number 6, 7, 8. So in here you can either type 8 or you can just type here -1, and this basically means to print out the last item inside this list. So now if you just execute this whole code, it will print out the last item that we have inside this list, and that is grapes. And now similarly, if you want to access the second last item, you can either type its exact index number, okay, or you can just simply type here -2, and it will print out the second last item that we have inside this list, which is 9. Now let's say that you want to access items, let's say from let's say 9 to banana. So for this, or let's say that you want to access items starting from this index till the end. So this item is at index number 0, 1, 2. So let's specify here 2 and then this column, and then and this basically means that include all the items starting from index number 2 till the end. So in here you can either type the index number of the last item plus 1, or you can just simply type here nothing, and this basically means that include all the items starting from index number 2 till the end. So now if you just execute this whole code, it's gonna print out all the items starting from index number 2, which is 9, till the end. So the last item is at grapes, so the last item is grapes, so it prints out all the items starting from index number 2 till the end. Now let's say that you only want to include items starting from index number 9 to, let's say, oranges. So this orange item is basically it's at index number, so this one is at 2, 3, 4, and 5. So in here, instead of specifying here 5, you basically need to specify 6, because it does not include the last specified item. So this basically means include all the items starting from index number 2 till index number 5, because it does not include the last specified item. So now if you just execute this whole code, it will print out all the items starting from index number 2 till index number 5. Alright, now let's say that you want to, let's say, update this item banana to something else. So this banana item is at index number 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So for this, you can just simply say list 1 and then the index number of that item that you want to update. So it is at index number 4, so just type here the index number of 4, and then just put it equal to any value that you want. So let's say that instead of banana, I want to have a numeric value, and that will be, let's say, 99. And now if you just print out this whole list, you will see basically 99 instead of this banana. So let's execute this whole code, and you will see basically 99 instead of banana, because we have updated the list and we set to Python that update the item at index number 4 and put it equal to 99. Now we can also insert items at the end of this list by using the append function basically inside this list. So what we can do is that we can call this function list1 dot append. Now append is basically a built-in function in Python, and what it does is that it basically add a new item that we want inside this list. So let's say that this new item, well, this new item can be anything, but let's say it will be cherry. So this append function will basically add this item cherry right at the end of this list, right at the end of this list. So now in here we are printing out this whole list after appending this item cherry. So now if you just execute this whole code, you will see this item cherry printed out right at the end of this list. Now we can insert items at any location inside this list using the insert function. So the append method always append an item at the end of the list, but we can use the insert function to insert item at any location inside this list. So let's call this function insert. Now this insert function basically takes two arguments. So again, this is basically a built-in function in Python, and this built-in function basically takes two arguments. The first one is basically the index number where you want to insert an item. So let's say that you want to insert an item at index number, let's say 0, 1, 2. So let's say we want to insert item at index number 2, and then for the second argument we need to specify what item we want to insert at index number 2. So let's say that we want to insert a new numeric value at index number 2, and that will be, let's say, 100. So now 100 will be at index number 2. So now the remaining items will basically move forward to one index to their original position that they are right now. So now this item 100 will be at index number 2, and now this 9 will be at index number 3, and now this apple will be at index number 4, and so on. So now let's execute this whole code. So we are basically printing out this whole list after inserting this new item at index number 2. So now let's execute this whole code, and you will see 100 at index number 2, and 9, which was previously at index number 2, is now at index number 3. So this is how we can insert items at any location in our list. Now similarly, we can remove items from the list as well. So let's say that you want to remove this item apple from the list. So for this, we can use a built-in function again in Python, and that is remove. And now this remove function basically takes the only argument that we want to remove. So let's say that we want to remove this item apple. So just type here the name of that item apple, and now let's execute this whole code, and you will now see this apple no more inside this list. Now similarly, if you want to clear out this whole screen, that is basically you want to remove each and every item from this list. So for this, you can use the clear function in Python, and again it is basically a built-in function. And now if you just execute this whole code, you will see that this list is now empty. So the clear function basically removes each item inside this list, but it does not delete this list. If you want to delete this list, for this you can basically use an attribute in Python, a built-in attribute in Python, and that is del. And now this attribute del will basically delete this list1. And now since we have deleted this list right here, but still we are printing it right here, so it will throw an error saying that this list does not exist because we have deleted it right here before printing it out on the console screen. So now if you just execute this whole code, you will see an error saying that name list1 is not defined because we have deleted it right here, and after deleting it, we're just trying to print out, but it is saying that this list does not exist because we have deleted that list right here. So this is what basically a list is, and we have covered some of the very useful functions of lists. Okay, now let's talk about tuple. Now tuple is like a list, that is, we can also store different items in it, but a tuple is not changeable or not mutable. That is, once we create a tuple, we cannot insert, delete, remove, or append items in it. While in case of list, we were able to insert, delete, remove, or append items. So now let's create a tuple. So first of all, I'm gonna name my tuple, and I will name this tuple as, let's say, tuple1. Well, again, you can name it anything you want, but I'm just naming it as tuple1. And I'll put it equal to these two round brackets. So for list, we were using these two square brackets, but for tuple, we need to use these two round brackets. And these two round brackets tells Python that, alright, I'm going to create a tuple. So now inside this tuple, we can insert different items, just like we were doing in case of list. So let's say that these items are 6, 9, 11, and let's say some string like apple, and then apple, and then let's say grapes, and then let's say some integer values like 8, 11, and so on. So now we can print out this whole tuple, like print tuple1, and execute this whole code. It will print out this whole tuple right here on this console screen. So while in case of a list, we were just able to append items, but now in case of tuple, we cannot append items. Like for example, we cannot do something like in here, like tuple dot append and append an item, let's say a new item, let's say banana. So it will basically throw an error saying that, let's say what the error says. So it's saying that the tuple object has no attribute append, because in tuple we cannot make changes to it once we have created that tuple right here. Well, we can insert items something like this, but this is not like changing a tuple. This is in here we are just creating that tuple, but once we create that tuple, we cannot make any changes. Now similarly, we cannot insert items, we cannot remove or delete items in that tuple. Now similarly, we can access different items in a tuple by their index number. So for example, we want to access the first item, let's say, which is at index number 0. So now if we just execute this whole code, it will just print out the first item, which is 6. And now similarly, if you want to access the last item, so the last item is at index number -1. So now if you just execute this whole code, it will print out the last item, which is 11. So this is how we can basically create a tuple and then access items in it. So it is exactly the same like list, but the difference is again the same. List is mutable and tuple is not mutable. So list is changeable. We can insert, append, delete, and remove items, while in case of tuple, we cannot do it. So yeah, that's all we need to cover about tuples. Okay, now let's talk about dictionary in Python. Previously, in case of list and tuple, we were accessing items with their index number. That is, Python knows about each item in case of list and tuple by its index number. Now in dictionary, we have something called keys. So we have items in a dictionary just like list and tuple, but now instead of index number, we now have keys, and we can name these keys anything we want. So it will make more sense once I create a dictionary. So let's say I will have a dictionary and I will have the names of the months in that dictionary. So I'm gonna name my dictionary as month, but you can feel free to name it anything you want and put it equal to these curly parentheses. And these curly parentheses tell Python that, alright, I'm going to create a dictionary. So previously in case of list, we were using these square brackets, while in case of tuples, we were using these round brackets. Now in case of dictionary, we use basically these curly brackets. Alright, now the first thing I will do is basically insert my first item, but first of all I need to have a key for that item. So let's say that the key of that item will be 1, and now with this colon I can now assign value to that key. So we can have the value for that key. So let's say for that value 1, for that value key, we will have the value of let's say January. Alright, so now we have a key, and now the value of that key is January. So now let's say that in the future I want to access this item January, so I can only access it with its index number. Now similarly, you can name it anything you want. Like for example, you can name it to a string. So for example, let's say you will name it as 1 in the string form. So now this 1 is basically the key, and then this January is the value of that key. So I'm gonna name it as, well, let's name it as like this in string. So now let's say that I will have another key, and it's this time it will be 2, and we will then have the value of that key will be, let's say, Feb, or let's say let's name it to full like February. And then we will have let's say on the third month, and then we have its value which will be March. and then let's say insert 2 more items. So the next item will be 4 and the value of it will be January, February, March, April. So April, and then the final item will be, let's say 5, and the value of it will be May. So now we have basically a dictionary. Well, let me just give it a space so that it can be visible. Alright, so now we have basically a dictionary in which we have 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 items, and now each item has a key with its value. So now if you want to print out this whole dictionary, we will just simply type print and then the name of this dictionary, which is months. And now if you just execute on this whole code, you will see basically this whole dictionary on the console screen. So here we have the whole dictionary, and now we have the values and then we have their keys. And now let's say that I only want to print out, let's say this item, which is March. So for this I need to specify its key, which is 3. So right here in these square brackets I can specify its key, which is 3. So we are basically accessing this item March with its key, which is 3. So now if you just execute this whole code, you will only see March on the console screen. Alright, now we can also use another method which is basically built into Python, and that function is known as get, to get the name of any item that we have in a dictionary. So get, and now inside basically this thing we need to specify the key. So let's say this time we want to access this item May. So just type here 5, which is the key of that item May, and now let's execute this whole code, and again you will see the output May. So this is how we can basically get items from the dictionary. Now let's say that you want to update items in this dictionary. So for this we'll do something like this. First of all, in here we will just update, let's say, an item. So I'll just type here months, and then basically the key of that value, whose value I want to update. So let's say that I want to update this item, let's say March, to something else. So first of all I will just specify access that item with its key, and then I will just change its value, for example let's say to December. So December, and now if we just execute, basically print out this whole dictionary, now instead of March you will see December right here in this dictionary. So in here you can see that we now have December because we have updated the item March to December. Alright, so this is how we can update items. Now let's say that you want to delete items from this dictionary. So for this let's say that you want to delete an item. So in here well, yeah, we can use this keyword del and then the name of the dictionary, and now in here we need to specify the item. So let's say that the item that we want to delete is, let's say, April. So we need to specify the key, its key value, and now we do not need basically this thing because we are not updating anything. So this will basically delete this item whose key value is 4. And now let's print out the whole dictionary. So let's type here print the name of the dictionary, which is months. And now let's execute this whole code, and now you will see just 4 items printed out on the console screen. You can see that the item whose key value is 4 is now no more inside the dictionary. Alright, now let's say that you want to clear out all the items that we have in this dictionary. So for this we're gonna use a clear method inside Python. So just type here months dot clear, and now just print out this whole dictionary, and you will see no items inside this dictionary. So you can see that the dictionary is empty. So just remember that the clear method basically clears out all the items that we have in the dictionary. It basically does not delete this whole dictionary from the memory. In order to delete this whole dictionary, we're gonna again use a keyword called del. So type here del and then the name of the dictionary, which is months. And now if we just try to print out basically this dictionary that I already have deleted right here, it will basically throw an error saying that that item does not exist, or the name months is not defined, because we already have deleted this dictionary right here. And now when I'm just trying to print this dictionary right here, it is basically throwing an error because that dictionary is now no more in memory. Now one last thing I want to teach is basically how we can get the length of this dictionary. So let's say that you want to find out the length of this dictionary. So for this we're going to use the len, or which basically stands for length, method inside Python. So make sure that you have basically first of all the parenthesis of this print statement, and then make sure that you have the parenthesis of this built-in function length as well, which is basically this one, and then this closing round parenthesis. And now if you just execute this whole code, it will basically print out the length of this dictionary, which is 5, because we have in total 5 items in this dictionary. So this is how we can create dictionary in Python, and this is how we can basically update and delete items from the dictionary. Alright, so now I'm going to be teaching you guys about another very important topic of Python known as the if statement. So the if statement is basically a decision making statement, and it allows us to make some decisions inside our program based on some condition. So let's say we want to execute a specific portion of a code when a certain condition is true, and I want to skip some portion of code if a certain condition is false. So now let's say that I will have a variable, and I will name this variable as is old, and I will put it equal to true. So I told you that in Boolean variable we only have two values. We can either have true or false. So now this variable is basically a Boolean variable, and we have true inside this Boolean variable. So now in here I will just check if that variable is true or not. So for this, in order to make some decisions in Python, we use a keyword called if. And now in here I will just check if that variable is underscore old is basically true or not. So I will just say that if that variable is equal to true. Now make sure that you put these two equal to symbols, because we are not assigning this variable is underscore equal the value of true. In fact, we are checking if that variable is true or not. So if you are checking if some variable is basically equal to some condition or not, then in here you need to put these two equal to symbol, and now Python knows that alright, I need to check if that variable is true or not. So make sure that you have these two equal to symbols. Alright, and now put this colon and enter inside the body of the if statement. Now any code that you want to be inside the body of the if statement, it must be indented like this. So any code outside the body of the if statement will not be the part of the if statement. So now let's say if that variable is true. Well, we know that this variable is true, but when we make real-time applications in Python, when we just write big programs, we do not know if that variable is going to be true or not. So let's say that we will say that if that variable is true or not, and let's say if it is true, then we're going to say that print you are an old person. So now if you just execute this whole code, you will see that it just prints out this thing because it knows that this variable is equal to true. So now let's say if we just change the value of this variable to, let's say, false, and now if we just execute this whole code, it's gonna print out nothing on the console screen because this condition is false, because it first of all checked if that variable is true or not, and from here it knows that this variable is not true, in fact it is false, so it just does not execute whatever we have inside the body of the if block. Now remember that it will basically execute anything that we have outside the body of the if statement. So let's say that we have this print statement outside the body of the if statement, and I will say that you are not an old person. So now if you just execute this whole code, you will see that it will not execute this code because it is inside the body of the if statement and this condition is false, but it will execute whatever we have outside the body of the if statement. So in here you can see that it just prints out this thing on the console screen. Now in here what we can do is that, so let me just get rid of this line of code, and now let's change basically this thing to true once again, or let's say it will be, let's say, false. Alright, so now we can just use another keyword, and it will basically first of all try to execute this line of code. If that condition is false, then it will just execute some other portion of code. So for this we're gonna use the keyword called else. Now remember that for each keyword else, it must have an if statement, it must have an if. So for example, if you're using the else, for example, if you're using this keyword else, then before it there must be an if statement. So when we use this keyword else, then there must also be the keyword if. So first of all, it will check if that variable is true or not. If that variable is not equal to true, then it's gonna come inside the body of the else block, and we will say that you are not an old person. So first of all, it will just try to execute this line of code, and if it is successful in executing this statement which is inside the if block, then it will simply skip the else block. But if that condition is false and it was unable to execute these statements, then it will come inside the else block and will execute whatever we have inside the else block, or whatever we have basically indented inside the else block. So now if you just execute this whole code, let's execute this whole code, and you will see this output: you are not an old person, because first of all it checks if that person is an old person or not. So the value of is old is false, so in here it is true, so this condition was false, so it comes inside the body of the else block and it just simply execute this line of code. So now let's say if I just change it to true, so just type here true, and now if you just execute this whole code, now it will just execute this line of code. That is, you can see this output on the console screen, because first of all it always tries to execute whatever we have inside the if block, and if it is successful in executing whatever we have inside the if block, then it just simply skip the else block. Alright, now let's say that I will have another variable, and that variable will be, let's say, is experience, and I will put it equal to, let's say, true as well. And now what we can do is that we can check for multiple variable as well. So let's say that I want that if a person is an old person, or we can say that we will use this keyword or, and I will explain it in a second, and is experience is equal to let's say true, then we're gonna basically execute this line of code. Now what does basically this means? Now make sure that this or is basically a keyword. So it is basically checking if this variable is true or not. So if any of this condition is true, basically if any of this condition right here and then right here is true, then it's gonna basically execute this line of code. So let's say that even if I have false here, then it will still execute this line of code, because it is only looking for one condition to be true, so that it can execute whatever we have inside the if block. So first of all, it checks for this condition. Since this condition is false, then it checks for this condition. But since this condition is true, and it only needs one condition to be true, if we have this keyword or to execute whatever we have inside the if statement. So now if you just execute this whole code, it will basically print out whatever we have inside the if statement. You can see that on the console screen as well. Now another thing that we can use is basically known as the AND keyword. And now when we use the keyword AND, then both of these condition must be true. That is, this condition must be true, and then this condition must be true as well. But now since we only have one condition true, that is basically this condition is false because this variable is true, but in here we are checking if that variable is a false. So this condition will be automatically false, so it will not execute this line of code, because if any of this condition is true, if any of this condition is false while we are using this keyword AND, then it will not execute whatever we have inside the if block. So now it's gonna basically come inside the else block and will execute basically this portion of code. So let's execute this whole code to check it, and you will see basically whatever we have inside the else block. Alright, now another thing that I want to teach is basically this keyword not. So let me just get rid of this thing right here, and basically in here we can use the keyword not. So first of all, what not does is basically it reverse the value of this variable is old. So for example, if that is a true, then it's gonna basically set it to false. This not will basically set it to false, and if that was, let's say, false, then it's gonna then this not keyword will basically set it to true. So now initially it is true, so this keyword not will just make it false, and now we are checking if that variable is false or not. Well, it is false now because we have made it false right here, so it's gonna basically execute whatever we have inside this if statement. So now let's execute this whole code, and again you will see whatever we have inside the if statement, that is, you are an old person. Alright, so now I want to teach you something else as well, and for this let me just get rid of basically these lines of code. And now let's say that instead of a boolean variable, we're gonna now have an integer value, and we will have, let's say, an integer value of, let's say, 49. And now in here I will check that if is old is, let's say, less than or equal to 25 years. So notice that I'm using this symbol less than. So now it will check if the variable is old, value is less than or equal to 25 years, then we're going to basically print out you are very young. And now we're going to have, let's say, and now we want to check something else as well. So for this, we're going to use an elif statement. And now in elif, we need to have another condition. And now I will say that is old is, let's say, less than or equal to 45. Then it's going to come inside the elif block and we're going to print out you are not very young. Or else we're going to basically come inside this else block. If both of these conditions are false, then it's going to come inside this else block finally, and we will say that you are an old person. Alright, so now let me explain. So first of all, it will check this condition. If this condition is false, then it will check this condition, and if this condition is false as well, then finally it will just execute whatever we have inside the else block. So now the value of is old variable is 49 years, so we know that both of these conditions are false, so it will basically execute whatever we have inside the else block. So now let's execute this whole code and you will see basically this thing printed out on the console screen. So now let's change its value to, let's say, 37 years. Alright, so first of all, now it will just check this condition. This condition will be false because the age is actually greater than 25 years. So it will now check this condition. Now this condition will be true. So it will basically print out this thing on the console screen, and then we'll simply ignore this else block. So now let's execute this whole code, and this time you will see this thing printed out on the console screen because this is the only condition which is true. Alright, now we can have a multiple condition, like for example, we will have let's say 35 years, and then in here we will have another elif statement. So I'll say that elif is underscore old is, let's say, less than or equal to 45 years. Then we're gonna say that print you are not very young. And now in here we'll say that you are young, just young. Alright, so first of all, now we have three conditions, 1, 2, and 3. First of all, it will try to execute. First of all, it will check this condition. If that condition is false, then it will check this condition. If that condition is also false, then it will check this condition. If that condition is also false, then finally it will execute whatever we have inside the else block. But if any of this condition is true, if any of this condition first of all gets true, then it will simply basically ignore the remaining conditions and will execute whatever we have basically in that block whose condition is true. So now if we just execute this whole code, this time it will basically execute this line of code because the age is less than or equal to 45 years, that is 37 years. So now let's execute this whole code, and you will basically see this thing printed out on the console screen. And now let's change its value to, let's say, 33 years. And now first of all it will encounter that this condition will be true, so it will then ignore the remaining condition, that is this one, and it will also ignore whatever we have inside the else block as well. So let's execute this whole code one last time, and you will see this time printed out on the console screen that we have inside basically inside this condition elif statement. So yeah, that's what I want to teach you about the if else statement. Now almost all the programs that you write, they have an if statement. So I hope that you understand it, and now you are able to make some decisions based on the if statement. Okay, now I want to talk about for loop in Python. Now in simple words, for loop is basically used to execute a specific portion of code again and again. Now in most cases, for loop is basically used to loop over different items that we have in a list, or maybe different letters that we have in a string. So let's have first of all the most simplest example of for loop in Python. Now let's say that you want to print out apple 5 times on the console screen. So now instead of doing it like this way, like printing print apple and then print apple once again and then print apple once again. Now let's say that you want to print out apple, let's say 5 times or maybe 100 times. So that way it will be more tedious and hardworking, and no one do it like this. Everyone uses for loop. So now we're gonna also use for loop to print apple, let's say 5 times or maybe 10 times on the console screen. So now I'm gonna use for loop. So first of all, in order to use for loop, we're gonna use this keyword for, and next we need to define a variable. Now I'm gonna explain what this variable is in a second. So I'll say that for x, which is basically the variable for that for loop, and then I will just say that for x in range. So now remember that this in is basically a keyword, and then we are using a built-in function in Python known as range. So now let's say that I will say that the range will start from 1 to 5. So now in order to have a range from 1 to 5, you need to specify here 6 because it does not include the last specified column. So it basically means that I want to assign x 5 values, that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but does not 6 because it does not include the last specified column. So now the value of x will always change based on the iteration. So now I'm basically using this for loop, and I will be giving 5 values to this x based on a specific iteration. So for the first iteration, the value of x will be equal to 1. For the second iteration, the value of x will be equal to 2. For the third iteration, the value of x will be equal to 3, and then for the fifth iteration, the value of x will be equal to 5. So remember that it does not include the last specified column. So it basically means that I want a range starting from 1 to 5, but not 6. And now I will just put this column and enter inside the body of this for loop. Oops, I think that I need to have a comma here. Alright, so in order to define a range, we need to use the comma here. So now let's say I will say that print apple, let's say 5 times on the console screen. Alright, so now first of all, for the first iteration, the value of x will be equal to 1, and now it will come inside the body of the for loop, and we'll just print out the value of apple when x is equal to true. And then for the second iteration, it will again come here, and now the value of x will be equal to 2. So now for the second iteration, when the value of x is equal to true, it will again print out apple. And now for the third iteration, the value of x will be now 3, and now for the third iteration, we also want to print out apple. And then similarly, for the fourth iteration, we also want to print out apple, and then similarly for the fifth iteration, we also want to print out apple. So now if you just execute this whole code, you will see apple 5 times on the console screen. Here we have apple 5 times on the console screen. Now you can have an if statement inside this for loop as well. Like for example, you can say that if x equal to 1, it means that when we have the first iteration, then we will come inside the body of the if block and we will print out apple. But if we have elif, we will say that elif x equal to 2, then we're gonna print out something else, that is, let's say grapes. And let's say that we only want to print out these two things. So now for x equal to 3, 4 and 5, it will print out nothing because we only want to print out these two values, apple and grapes, when x is equal to 1 and when x is equal to true, and when x is equal to 2. We are printing out nothing else. So now if you just execute this whole code, you will now only see these two things, apple and grapes, on the console screen. Now similarly, you will have the value of x is equal to 3, 4 and 5 as well, but you cannot have the value of x equal to 7 or 6. So if I just say elif x equal to let's say 6, and now just print out, let's say banana. Oops, oh my god. You are seeing just the value of apple and grapes again because the value of x is out of range when x is equal to 6. So that was basically the most simplest example of for loop. Now basically in most cases I told you that for loop is basically used to loop over different items that we have in a list, or maybe different letters that we have in a string. So now let's have an example of a string. So now let me just get rid of this line of code, and now in here I will say that for x in basically this string, and the string will be, let's say, I am the console screen. Let's make it small, just the console screen. Alright, so now what it will do is that first of all the value of x will be equal to c, and then the value of x will be equal to o, and then so on. So now if you just say that print simply x, you will basically see each letter of this whole string printed out on the console screen. So let's execute this whole code, and you will basically see each letter that we have inside the string console screen printed out on the console screen. Now similarly, we can use for loop to iterate over different items that we have in a list. So let's say that I will have a list, and I'll name my list as list1 and put it equal to, let's say, some names like, for example, Taylor, and then let's say Arusa, and then Bill, and then Steve, and then finally let's say Katie. So now I will say that for x in list1, I'm gonna print out x. So first of all, the value of x will be equal to Taylor, so we're gonna print out that value Taylor. For the next iteration, the value of x will be equal to Arusa, so we're gonna print out x, which is basically now Arusa for the second iteration. And now for the third iteration, the value of x will be equal to Bill, so we're gonna print out Bill, and so on. So now let's execute this whole code, and you will see basically all the names printed out on the console screen. Alright, so this is how we can basically use a for loop. So for loop is basically used to execute a specific portion of a code again and again, and then similarly it is used to iterate over different items in a list, and then similarly it is also used to iterate over different letters that we have in a string. So let's say, let me just do it last time. So I will say that for x in range 1 to 9, well, this range can be anything. It can start from, let's say, a 9 to, let's say, 100, or maybe 5 to, let's say, 10,000, and so on. That is totally up to you. So now I will say that for x in range, let's say 1 to, or let's say 6 to, let's say 20. So now I will say that if x modulus 2 is equal to 0, I'm gonna print out x. Alright, now what does this basically means? So basically I'm checking that if the value of x is divided by 2 and the remainder is 0, then I only want to print out that x value. So basically I'm printing out all the even numbers that we have inside this range 6 to 19. So again, it does not include the last specified column. So if you also want to include 20 in this range, so you need to specify here 21. So the range is now 6 to 20, and now I'm only printing out those values in between 6 to 20 that are even number, because in here I'm checking that if the remainder after dividing that value with 2 is equal to 0, then I'm gonna print out only that value. Simple as that. And now let's execute this whole code, and now you will see all the even numbers printed out on the console screen starting from 6 to 20. So yeah, this is all we need to cover about for loop, and this is how we can basically use for loop in Python. Okay guys, I'm gonna now talk about the input statement in Python. So the input statement is used to take input from the user while the program is in the running state. So basically the user can be able to interact with our program while our program is in the running state, and our program will be able to produce the desired output based on the user interaction. So let's say that we will have a variable, and now inside this variable we will basically store that result that the user has input while the user has inputted while our program is in the running state. So for this, we're gonna basically use this built-in function in Python known as input. And now inside this argument, inside this built-in function Python, as an argument, we will say that enter your age. So now when the user input his age while our program is in the running state, then it will store that age in this variable a, and now we will print out his age. So we'll say that print you are years old. So yeah, years old. Make sure that we have this comma here. Alright, so now first of all we are taking some kind of input from the user, and then that input that the user will supply will be stored in this variable a. So now let's execute this whole code and it will make more sense. So first of all, you can see that it is asking for the age. So let's say that the age of a person is 26 years, and now hit enter. You can see that it is saying that you are 26 years old. So first of all, it just took this input while our program is in the running state, and then it says that you are 26 years old. So now let's make this thing a little more amazing. So we will say that enter any number. So let's say that we will say that enter any number. So now the user will input any number, and now we'll check that if a modulus 2 equal to 0, we will say that print the user has inputted an even number, or else we will say that print the user has inputted an odd number. Alright, so first of all, we are basically taking input from the user while our program is in the running state, and then storing that value or number in this variable a. And now we are checking that if we just divide that number by 2, and if the remainder is 0, means that the user has supplied an even number, so we are printing out this message on the console screen. Or if that condition is false, it's going to come inside this else block, and then obviously when a number is not an even number, then obviously it is an odd number. So now let's execute this whole code once again. And first of all, it's going to ask for, well, let's make it a little more prettier. And now let's execute this whole code once again. Oops, right here. Stop and rerun. Yeah. Okay, so now you can see that it is asking for any number, and now in here we can enter any number while our program is still in the running state. So let's say that this number will be 34. But if I just hit enter, it will just throw an error saying that not all the arguments converted during a string formatted. Alright, so basically the number that we supplied here, it actually sometimes does not convert that number into integer. Well, basically Python is a very smart language. Any value that we will supply here, it basically knows that what we are supplying. But sometimes it does not know that we are supplying an integer value or a string value. So by default, it is basically considering that value as string value. So previously it was converting that value, that string value into an integer value while we were printing the age of that person. But this time when we are taking this modulus, it is not converting that string value into integer value. Now we have to do it. So to do it, we just simply say that int this thing, and it basically means that convert that value that the user will input into an integer function. So let's say that you have an integer value and you want to convert it into a string. So for this, you can use this keyword str, or it is basically a function. You can use this function str, but now since we want to convert a string value into an integer value, so we will use this function, or it is basically a class integer. Well, I'm going to talk about classes and object later on in this video. So now if I just execute this whole code, it will now run successfully. First of all, it will ask for any number, and let's say that this number is 56. And now if I just hit enter, it is saying that the user has inputted an even number because this condition is true. So it prints out this thing on the console screen. So now let's say if I just input some odd value, like for example 89, and now let's execute this whole code. And now this time, oh my god, it is basically 89. I need to hit enter, and now you can see that it is saying that the user has inputted the odd number. So this is what an input function is, and this is how we can use it in Python. Okay guys, I'm gonna be now talking about the while loop in Python. Now the while loop, just like the for loop, is also used to execute a specific portion of a code for a specific number of times. But the syntax is a little different from the for loop. Now in case of while loop, first of all, we need to initialize the variable of the while loop. So in here, let's say that we will say that while I equal to, let's say, 0. So we are basically initializing a variable and we are setting the value of it equal to 0. Now remember, in case of a for loop, we were using the range function and we were telling that the starting position of the range will be, let's say, 0, and then the ending position of the range will be, let's say, 10. But this is not the case with the while loop. We have to initialize the starting position of the range in a separate variable, and we name that variable as I. And now since we now have the initial position of our while loop, basically we have that variable in which we store that initial starting position of the range. So now we will now use the while loop. Now in order to use the while loop, we just type while and then that variable, which is I, and we'll say the while I is less than equal to, let's say, 10, and then we put this colon and hit enter. And now whatever you want to be inside the while loop must go inside the body of the while loop, that is it must be indented. So now in here, let's say that we will print out this value I, and now another thing we need to make sure is that we need to increment this value as well. Like for example, if I just execute this whole code, it's gonna print out the value of I, which is equal to 0 infinite number of times. That is the value of I will not be like 2, 3, 4 or 5 by itself, but in here, once we print out that value, then we're gonna say that now just add 1 to that value as well. Like for example, I will say that in here, once you print out that value, then I will say that I equal to I plus 1. And this is basically incrementing this value, which is I. So first of all, the value of I will be 0. It's gonna print out 0, and now in here we are incrementing it. So previously it was 0, and now it will be 1, and now the value of I here will be 1, and now it's gonna print out 1, and then again we are incrementing the value of I. So previously it was 1, and now this time it will be 2. Now this while loop will now run for I equal to 2, so it's gonna print out first of all 2, and now the value of I will become 3, and so on. So this while loop will work till the value of I equal to 10. So once we have the value of I equal to 10, then it's gonna basically increment this value to 11. So now it's gonna come here while the value of I is equal to 10. So this condition will be false because the value of I, which is now 11, is not less than or equal to 10. So it's gonna come out of this while loop. So in here, let's say we'll print out this message outside the body of the while loop, and we will say that end of while loop. So yeah, now if I just execute this whole code, and you will see first 10 whole number on the console screen. So in here you can see that after it prints out the first 10 whole number, it prints out this message that the body of while loop has ended. Now in here it is not necessary that you increment this value by 1, but you can either increment it by 2 or 3, or you can just perform any expression here. Like for example, you can multiply the value of I by 2, or let's say divide the value of I by, let's say, 2 or something like this, or you can just divide it and then multiply it by some value or something like this. That is, you can just use in here, you can use any mathematical expression that you want. So now let's say that I will just increment this value by 4, and now if you just execute this whole code, so you will see that it will just print out first of all 0, because initially the value of I will be 0. So first of all it prints out a 0, and then we incremented the value of I2 plus 4. So 0 plus 4 equal to 4, and now again the value of, and now again this loop will run, but this time the value of I will be 4. So it will just check while 4 is less than or equal to 10, so the condition is true. So it's gonna print out that number, which is now 4, and now again the value of I will be incremented by 4. So previously it was 4, so now 4 plus 4 equal to 8. So now the value of 8 is equal to 10. So again it is less than or equal to 10. So again it's going to print out this value I, and then finally again it will increment this value by 4. So now this time the value of I is equal to 12. So it now again checks that while I, whose value is now 12, is less than or equal to 10. So this time the condition is false. So it's going to come out in here. It will basically come out the body of the while loop and will print out this message end of while loop, which you can see right here on the console screen. Now similarly, you can just type something like anything, like here, like for example, I will just type Taylor 3 times on the console screen and just run it again, and you will see the name of Taylor, who was my class fellow in university 3 times on the console screen. Alright, now let's make it a little more interesting by just printing out the sum of first, let's say 10 natural number on the console screen. So in here I will just get rid of, well, just no need to get rid of here. So in here we will just initialize the value of I equal to 1, and now I will just create a variable and I will name this variable as, let's say, 0. And now instead of printing out this name, what we will do is that we will say that I equal to I plus 1, and now I will say that sum equal to sum plus I basically. So what I'm doing is that I'm basically finding out the sum of first 10 natural number and then storing it in this variable sum. So once it calculated the sum of all the 10 natural number, I'm gonna print out this sum right here, and I will say that print sum basically outside the body of the while loop, because in the while loop we are just calculating the sum of the first 10 natural number, and once it has calculated the sum of first 10 natural number, then finally we are printing out that sum outside the body of the while loop. Alright, so now if you just execute this whole code, you will see the sum of first 10 natural number, which is 55. Well, let me just explain this code if you're not getting it. So first of all, the value of I will be 1, so this condition will be true. So the sum of the value of sum initially was 0, so 0 plus 1 equal to 1. So now the value of sum is actually equal to 1. And remember that the value of I was initially 0, but now in here we are incrementing it by 1. So now in here it will become 2. So this condition is again true. So previously the value of sum was basically 1, and now we have the value of 2. So 1, which was the previous value of sum, and then the value of I is basically 2. So 1 plus 2 equal to 3. So now we have the sum of the value of sum equal to 3, and in here we are incrementing the value of I equal to basically incrementing the value by 1. So in here the value of I is equal to 3. So this is how basically this while loop will work. Well, let me just do one last thing before I end this while loop. So in here we can basically say that basically in here I will just take an input from the user. So I will say that n equal to input, enter any number. So once the user input any number, we will now say that the while loop should run as that many times the user has input that number, and then we're gonna find out the sum of those number, the sum of all the sum of first 10 natural number up to the value that the user has specified right here in the variable n, and then we are storing that sum in this variable sum, and then finally we are printing out that sum right here on the console screen. So let's execute this whole code, and first of all it will just ask me to input any value, to input any number. Now let's say that I want to find out the sum of, let's say, first 100 natural number, and I will just hit enter. Oops, it is saying that we are getting some kind of error, because it is saying that because I told you that you may get sometimes this error, but if you get this error, just simply type int and then n, and now if you just execute this whole code, this time it should work absolutely fine. So just hit here 100, and there we go. So the sum of first 100 natural number is 5050. So this is how we can use a while loop in Python. Alright guys, now I'm gonna be teaching you guys about the break and continue statement in Python. First of all, let's talk about the break statement. Now the break statement basically takes the program control out of the loop. So let's have an example of it. So let's say that I will have my for loop. So I will say that for x, basically inside the string marketing, I'm gonna say that in here I will just come inside the body of the for loop, and I will say that if x equal to basically this letter E, I will say that break. And now outside the body of the for loop, I will say that print program has ended. Alright, now what I'm doing here. Alright, so first of all, I'm just looping over each character inside this string, and now I will say that if the value of x equal to this character E, I'm gonna break. Now what this break will do is that it will just take the program out of the for loop and then perform whatever we have outside the for loop. So first of all, it will check if the value of if the value of x is equal to e. If it is not, then it's gonna just keep printing out that value. So I'll say that print on that value x, or if the value of x is equal to e, then you can just take that program out of this for loop and we'll just simply print out this message on the console screen. So let me just execute this whole code and then I will explain more. Alright, so you can see that it basically prints out, first of all, the first 4 characters on the console screen, and as soon as it encounters this character e, it just take the program control out of this for loop. Basically it came outside this for loop and then just print out this message, program has ended. Alright, so first of all, the value of x is equal to m. So in here this condition was false, so it does not come inside the body of this if block. So inside this if block we have only this break statement, so it then just simply print out that character which was m, and then the value of x equal to a. So again it checks that if the value of x is equal to e or not. Well, it is not, so it just prints out this that character which is now a, and then it prints out similarly r and then k. And now finally when it encounters this character e, it just basically execute this line of code which was inside the body of the if block. So it just execute this line of code. This break statement basically took the program control outside the for loop and then just simply print out whatever we have outside the for loop. So we only have this line of code outside the for loop in which we are saying that the program has ended. So it just prints out this message right here on the console screen. So I hope it is making sense. And now let's talk about the continue statement in Python. So now in here, if I just minimize it, if I just use this statement continue instead of break, and now if I just execute this whole code, you will see that it just print out, you can see that it prints out m a r key, but it does not prints out e and then t-i-n-g. So it just prints out all the character except this character e. Now let me just explain it. Alright, so first of all, in here, if we can just make it a little down. Alright, so first of all, we have the value of x equal to m. So this condition was false, so it just prints out this character m, and then similarly a, r, k, and now when it encounters this character e, it says continue, means that does not execute the remaining code inside the for loop for that value of x. So it basically again come here without printing out this thing right here. So continue will basically takes the program again to the for loop, but it will now check the other condition. So previously the value of x is equal to e, but now the value of e will be t. So it just prints out then t, I, n, and g. It does not print out this character e because that continue statement basically stopped him to execute the remaining part of the for loop for that specific value of x. So it again come here for the next value of x, which was t. So again it prints out t and then I, n, and g. So I hope both of these statements make sense. If it doesn't, then just go through this tutorial 1 or 2 times and I'm sure it will make a lot of sense. So this is how we can use the break and continue statement in Python. Well, the break statement is very important. We basically used it a lot whenever we want to take our program control out of the loop while making real-time applications in Python. Now I'm going to be talking about some of the built-in mathematical functions in Python. Now by built-in function, I mean that function that are already in Python, we just need to use it by calling it. So in this video, so basically in this part, we're going to use some of the built-in mathematical function in Python. Now to use this mathematical function, we're going to use a math module in Python. Now just know that a module is something in which we have built-in functions and we can use this module to call these built-in functions. Now previously we were also using built-in functions while we were covering dictionary, list, and strings, but remember we were not using any module for that. And the reason for this is that those functions are there in Python by default, so we can directly use them without using any module. But this is not the case with built-in mathematical function. So we need to import the math module in Python. So right here at the top, I will just say that import the math module. So just type here import import the math module, and this is basically the module in which we have a lot of built-in functions, and these built-in function basically contains information about all of these basically mathematical functions that we can use inside this module by just calling these functions. Like for example, let's say that I want to find out the square root of some number. So first of all, I need to type the name of the module that we have imported, dot, and then any function. Like for example, these are all the functions that we can basically use inside the math module. So these functions are already there in this module math, we just need to call it. Like for example, we can call this function sqrt to find out the square root of any number. And basically the square root function will basically calculate, will take the job of finding the square root of that number. We just need to call that function and then supply the value of that number whose square root we want to find. So let's call this function sqrt right here, and now in here inside these two square brackets, basically as a parameter, we need to pass that value we need to pass that value that we want to calculate the square root of. So let's say that I want to calculate the square root of, let's say, 4. Now we can basically store it in a variable. Let's call this variable as x. Well, you can just directly print it something like this, and then make sure that you have the parentheses of the print statement and then this sqrt function as well. So the parentheses of this print statement is this one, and then we have the parentheses of this sqrt function. So now let's execute this code, and you will see the square root of 4, which is 2, on the console screen. So right here you can see 2 on the console screen, which is the square root of 4. Now let's say that you want to find the absolute value of some number. So for this, we can use basically a function in that math module known as fabs. And now in here we need to supply the value whose absolute value we want to find. So let's say that we want to find the absolute value of -8. So the absolute value of -8 is basically +8. So the absolute function, if you don't know, basically converts negative values into positive values. Alright, now another function that we can use is basically the factorial function. So just type here factorial, and now let's say that you want to find out the factorial of 5. So now if you just execute this whole code, you will find the factorial of 5, which is 120. Now if you don't know what a factorial is, so let's say that I'm finding the factorial of 5. So the factorial of 5 basically means 5 multiplied by 4 multiplied by 3 multiplied by 2 multiplied by 1. So the factorial of any number basically starts from that number, and then we keep on multiplying that number all the way down to 1. So similarly, if you want to find out the factorial of 6, then we would do something like this: 6 multiplied by 5 multiplied by 4 multiplied by 3 multiplied by 2 multiplied by 1, and then same goes for remaining numbers as well. So if the factorial of 5 is equal to 120, you can see that 5 multiplied by 4 is equal to 20, and then 20 multiplied by 3 is equal to 60, and then we have 120, and then 120 multiplied by 1 is equal to 120. So here we have the result 120. Now let's say that you want to find out the log of some value. So for this, we can basically use a function in Python known as log. So right here you can specify log, and now the first argument it takes is basically the base of that log. So let's say that we want to use, sorry, for the first parameter it takes is basically the log of the value that we want to find. So let's say that I want to find the log of 2, and then the next argument it takes is basically the base of that log. So this basically means that find out the log of 2 with the base value of 3. So now if you just execute this code, it's gonna find out the value of log 2 with the base 3, which is 0.6309, and so on. Now similarly, you can do it something like this as well by using the log2 function, and now in here you just need to specify the value of log that you want to find. So let's say that I want to find the log of, let's say, 3, and it basically means that find out the log of 3 with the base of 2. So let's execute this code, and it's gonna find out the value of log 3 with the base 2, which is 1.584, and so on. Now similarly, you can find out the value of log with base 10 as well. So just specify here 10 and execute this whole code, and you're gonna find out the log of 3 with base 10, which is 0.477. Now let's say that you want to find the power of some value. So let's say that you want to find, for this we use a function called POW, and now for the first argument we need to specify, let's say 3, and for the second argument we will specify 2, and this basically means find the value of 3 to the power 2. So it should be 9. So let's execute this whole code, and you will see the value of 9 on the console screen. Now similarly, we can find the greatest common divisor of two numbers using the GCD function in the math module. So just type here GCD, and now let's say that we want to find out the GCD of, let's say, 30 and 20. So if you just execute this whole code, it should be 10 printed out right here on the console screen. Now similarly, we can perform some trigonometry function as well. So for example, I want to find the sine value of some number. So let's say that I want to find the sine of 30. So if you don't know what basically this sine function is, it is basically a lot used in physics. So even if you are a little familiar with physics, then you should know what this sin or sine function is. So if you just execute this whole code, it's gonna find out the sine of 30, which is negative 0.988, and so on. Now similarly, we can find the cos of any value as well. So let's say that I want to find the cos of 30. So it is 0.1542. Now similarly, we can find the tan of this number 30 as well. So let's execute this whole code. It's gonna print out the tan of 30, which is negative 6.4 53311 966 46276. All right, now similarly, if you want to find out, let's say, the inverse of sine, so in here I will use a function known as sine h and then the value, and this will basically find out the inverse sine of 30. So if you just execute this whole code, it's gonna print out a value which is this huge value printed out on the console screen. And then similarly, you can use the cos, the inverse cos, and then the tan, and then the inverse tan as well. Now another function that I want to teach is basically the degrees function. So right here, if you use this function, degrees, and then give any value inside it, then it will basically convert that value from radian to degrees. So let's execute this whole code. So the radian of this value 30 is basically 1718.87, and so on. Now similarly, if you just specify here radians, so what it will do is that it will convert this value from radian to degree. So let's see the degree value of this value 30. So it is 0.523 59598, and so on. Alright, now we can also find out the hypotenuse value as well. So for this, we use a function in the math module known as HYPOT. So if you don't know what basically this hypotenuse function is, so it will basically calculate something like this. So inside this hypotenuse function, it is basically SQRT, and then basically, so in here we basically need to specify two values, the value of A and B. So in here it will just find out basically this thing 30 multiplied by 30 plus 40 multiplied by 40. So this thing right here is basically equivalent to this thing. So the value of this thing and then this thing is exactly the same. So let's execute this whole code, and you will see the hypotenuse of these two values, which is 50, exactly 50. Now let's say that you want to see the value of pi. So for this, you can just simply type math.py, and it will tell you the pi, which is 3.14159265. So let's execute this whole code, and you will see the value of pi, which is 3.14159265, and so on. Now similarly, if you want to find out the value of e, basically the exponent function, so basically the exponent, so let's execute this whole code, and the value of exponent is 2.71828, and so on. Now if you want to find out the value of exponent to the power something. So for this, we can basically use a function known as exp. Now let's say that you want to find out the value of exponent to the power, let's say 5. So now if you just execute this whole code, so it will basically calculate the value of exponent to the power 5, which is 148.41315, and so on. Now another thing I want to teach you is known as the copy sign function in the math module. So in here, if you just call this function copy sign, so now let's say that in here I will just specify the value of, let's say 10, and then let's say for the second value I will specify -6. Now what it will do is that it will basically return the first value, basically this value 10, but with the sign of the second value. So it will basically consider the sign of this value, which is negative, but it will consider this value. So it will just basically return this first value 10, but it will just take this sign and then we'll add it with this value 10. So now the output of it will be -10 because we have negative with the second value. So this is what the copy sign function do. You will see -10 on the console screen. Now the final two function I want to teach is basically the ceil and the floor function. So right here, if you just specify, let's say ceil, and let's say that I will just specify the value of, let's say 4.2. So basically the ceil function will basically return the smallest integer value greater than the number, which is 4. So let's execute this whole code and I will then explain. So in here you will see 5. So basically it returns, the ceil function basically returns the smallest integer value greater than that number. So basically we have the value of 4, so it will basically return the smallest number. It does not consider this point. Even if we have, let's say 4.1 or 4.9 here, it will basically round off this number to the nearest possible integer value. So the nearest possible integer value of 4 is 5, so it's gonna basically round it off to 5. So even if you have 1 here, 4.1 here, it will even then show the value of 5. Now the other function that we have is basically the floor function. So just type here floor, and now let's say that you will have the value of in here 4.9. So just execute this whole code, it will basically prints out 4 on the console screen because the floor function basically returns the greatest integer value smaller than that number. So in here even we have 4.9 here, so it basically ignores that point because the smallest value after rounding it off, the smallest value of it is basically 4. So even if we have negative 4.1 here, or even 4.9 or even 4.8, it will still return this value of 4. So this is what this ceil and the floor function is. So these are some of the mathematical functions that we have inside the math module. So there are so many modules that we're going to be using basically inside this course. So it will then make a lot of sense. So I hope that it's making a lot of sense. So this is how we can basically use different mathematical function inside this module, math. Okay, now I want to talk about comments in Python. Now comments are lines of code that are simply ignored by Python. The purpose of this is to basically provide information about the code. So for example, you have a program in which you have, let's say 1000 or more functions. Now you can add a comment with each function telling the user about each function. So let's say that, so in here we can add a comment with this symbol hash, and now anything that we type basically right after this hash symbol will simply be ignored by Python. So let's say that I will say that, hey, I am a command. So after this I will say that print, let's say me. So it will just only execute this line of code and it will not consider basically this line of code because comments are something that are totally ignored by Python or any programming language. So let's execute this whole code and it will only print out basically this thing on the console screen, which is me. Alright, now let's make it a little useful by quickly creating like 4 function. The first one will be, let's say add, and it will just print out like, for example, add, and let's copy this line of these 2 lines of code. So just copy and let's paste it right here and then right here basically, and make sure that you have identified, And now let's paste this code one last time. Alright, so now let's rename it to, let's say, for example, the second function will be, let's say, sub, and then the third function will be, let's say, div, and then the final function will be, let's say, mul. Now in here, for each function, we can add a command telling the user that this function is doing this thing. So we can add a command for basically this addition function, and we will say that this is an addition function. And now in here, I will just copy this command and we'll just paste it right here, and I will say that this is a subtraction function, and then similarly I will just paste that command and I will say that this is the division function, and then finally I'll just paste that command right here and I will say that this is the multiplication function. Alright, so this is basically how commands are useful. It basically provides information to the user about the program. So commands are basically very useful when you have a very big program and you want to tell the user about each portion of the program. Like for example, at one part of the program you will tell the user that this part is doing this thing. At the other portion of the program you will tell that this portion is doing this thing, and then this portion is doing this thing, and so on. Now if you want to add a multi-line command, then what you can do is that in here, so let's say that you want to tell a very long, you want to convey a very long and lengthy message to the user with a command. So this can basically not fit in, so that let's say that message cannot fit in one line, then you can add a multi-line command in Python as well inside these three quotation mark. So right here, in here you can just type anything and it will consider be the part of the command. Like for example, you will say that this is an addition function and will basically add two numbers and will give you the result very fast. So this is how you can have a multi-line command in Python. So this is what commands are, and this is how we can add commands in our Python code. Alright guys, now I want to talk about the nested if statement in Python. Now an if statement inside another if statement is called the nested if statement. So let's have an example of it. So let's say that I will ask the user to input any value in between 100 to 300. So in here we will store that value, and I will name this variable as value, but you can feel free to name it anything you want. And then I will say that input, and then I will just ask the user to input any value. So enter any value in between 100 to 300. So now in here the user will input any value, and that value will be stored in this variable value. And now in here I will check that if that value is less than, let's say, 150, then I'm gonna come inside this if block and I will say that print value is less than 150, or else if the value is greater than 150, then it's gonna come inside this else block and we will say that print value is greater than 150. Now we have basically this if block and then we have this else block. Now let's say that after checking this condition that we have for the if statement, we want to check for something else. Let's say that we want to check what exactly this value is. So let's say that if this condition is true, means that the value is less than 150. So in here we will use another if statement, let's say, and I will say that if value is equal to let's say 100, then I'm gonna come inside this if statement, the block of basically this if statement, and I will say that print value is exactly 100, or I will say that elif, let's say value equal to let's say 50, then I will say that print value is exactly 50. Or finally we will say that else, we will say that print value is even less than 50. Alright, so what I'm doing here, so let's say first of all I'm asking the user to input any value in between 100 to 300, and then in here I'm checking that if that value that the user has inputted is less than 150 or not. So let's say assume that if the user has inputted a value less than 150, so this condition will be true, so it's gonna print out basically this thing on the console screen. And then in here we are again checking that we know that the value is less than 150, but we don't know what exactly this value is. So again we will check here that if that value is equal to 100, then we're going to print out this message. Or let's say that the value is equal to 150, then we're going to print out this message. Or if the value is less than 150, then we're going to come inside this else block and we will say that value is even less than 150. So basically we have this if statement, and then inside the body of this if statement we have basically this if statement as well. So this is what basically an if statement is. So an if statement inside another if statement is called the nested if statement. So when you are writing real-time programs, the use of nested if statement is very common. So I hope that you are getting my point of how we are using this nested if statement right here in our program. So let's say that if this condition is false, then it's gonna come inside this else block, because for this if statement the else is right here, and then for this if statement the elif or else block is right here. So let's say if that condition is not true, then it's gonna check this condition, or else it's gonna check this else block for this if statement. So you need to make sure that if you have an else statement, then it must have an if statement. But you can have only if statement. It is not compulsory to use the else statement, but when you have an else statement, then you must have an if statement for that else block as well. Alright, so I hope it is making a lot of sense. So now let's execute this whole code, and yeah, let's execute this whole code. Alright, so first of all, it's gonna ask me to input any value in between 100 to 300. So let's say that I input the value of let's say 100 and hit enter. Alright, so it is again giving me this error, because in here we need to basically make sure that it basically convert basically this value that we input into an integer value. So in here I will say that int, and then we're gonna surround this whole thing with this. And now this int function that we have used previously in this video as well, but it will make sure that the number that the user has inputted is converted into an integer value, so that we can perform such type of operations. So now if we just execute this whole code, and now this time we will have no error. So let's say that the value is, let's say 100, and now if I hit enter, alright, so it is saying that the value is less than 150, because first of all it checks this condition, and we know that, and the user has inputted basically 100 value, so this condition is true. So first of all it prints out this message, and then it checked if that value that the user has inputted is equal to 100 or not. If it is 100, then it is basically printing out this message that the value is exactly 100. So let's execute this whole code to input some other value which is greater than 150. So let's say that the value is, let's say 200, and now if we just hit enter, so it is saying that the value is greater than 150, because it is greater than 150. So in here it is checking basically this condition, and if this condition is getting false, then it is basically moving the program basically to the else block of this if statement. So make sure that you know this thing, that what is the else block of which if. So remember that for this if block we have this else block, and then for this if statement we have this else block, and then basically this if statement is basically coming inside this if statement. So this is what the nested if statement is, and this is how we can use it in Python. So make sure that you understood it. If not, then just go through the tutorial one or two more times, and I'm sure it will make a lot of sense. Okay, now let's talk about the nested for loop in Python. So just like the nested if statement, a loop inside another loop is called the nested loop. So first of all, we will have a very basic example of, let's say, nested for loop. So in here, I will say that for, let's say I in, a range. Let's say we're gonna say that the starting value will be, let's say, 1, and then the ending value will be, let's say, 5. Basically it is 4 because it does not include the last specified value. So it basically means that the range starts from 0 and then ends at 4. So we are basically assigning values. The first value that the I will get is basically 1, and then 2, 3, and 4, and then not 5. Alright, so let's say that I'm just printing out on this basically variable I. So now if you just execute this whole code, it's gonna print out I 5 times on the console, sorry, 4 times on the console screen. Alright, now let's say that I want to have another for loop inside basically this for loop. So that loop will then become the nested for loop. So let's say that I will just say that for j in range, let's say again 1 to 5, then I'm gonna print out, let's say, j. Alright, so basically first of all it basically means that this loop will basically execute whatever it has inside it, whatever it has inside that block, basically that for block. It will execute it 4 times because we have the range starting from 1 till 4. So basically this for loop will basically execute this code 4 times. So let's say that the value of I will be, let's say, 1. So it's gonna first of all print out this variable I, and then in here it will execute basically this whole code starting from 1 till 4. So let's say that when the value of I is equal to 1, so when this loop will run 1 time, it's gonna execute this loop 4 times because we have set the limit again to 1 to 5. Alright, so now let's execute this whole code and then I will explain more. So let's execute it, and basically you will see this output on the console screen. So let me just scroll it up, and then let me just show you the code as well. Alright, so let's scroll it up as well. Alright, so first of all the value of I is equal to 1. So in here first of all it prints out this whole thing. So remember that it will keep on executing whatever it has inside this whole block until whatever it has inside it has completed. So it will first of all execute this whole code when the value of I is equal to, let's say, 1. So it's gonna print out first of all I, and then it will basically execute this for loop, basically this for loop when the variable is j 4 times. So you can see that we have printed out j. It has printed out j 4 times right here on the console screen. And then again the value of I will become 2 because it has now executed this whole code 1 time successfully, and now it's gonna again run it when the value of I will be, let's say, 2. So now this time the value of I will be 2, so it just prints out this this variable I, and then again this will run 4 times because I told you that when this loop is running 1 time, it's gonna execute whatever it has inside it as long as it has completed that execution. So this loop will only complete its execution when it will run starting from range 1 to 4. So again it prints out j 4 times on the console screen. And now let's say when the value of I is equal to 5, so this condition will be false because as you know that it does not include the last specified column, so this condition will be false and our program will end. So again, I hope it is making sense. So this was basically the most simplest example of for loop. Well, it is more likely if you are a complete beginner to computer programming that this thing here will not make sense. Well, I remember that when I was learning nested for loop for the first time, I was having a very hard time learning it, understanding it. So if you're not getting it at the moment, well, I have just taught you a very simple example so that you can understand it. But if you're not still getting it, then just make sure that you go through the tutorial again and again as long as you don't understand it. Just keep looping it in your mind as well that when the value of I will be 1, then it will just execute this whole code as long as it has completed the execution 1 time completely. So yeah, this is how we can use nested for loop in Python. Alright guys, so in this part I'm gonna show you another example of nested for loop, and after you're just done with this example, I hope that the nested for loop will then make a lot more sense. So let's say that I have a list and I will name this list as, let's say, list 1, and I will put it equal to, let's say, some this list, and let's say in this list I have some items, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Now let's say if I just print out this whole list, it will just simply print out all these items are right here on the console screen. But let's say what I want is that I want to have multiple lists inside this list. So that will be like kind of the nested list in which we will have list inside another list. So what I'm gonna do is that basically, let me just get rid of basically this thing here as well. And now I'm gonna hit enter. Alright, now we have basically this list bracket right here. And now inside this list, I will have, let's say, the first item as a list. So let's say I will just create another list inside this list. And now inside this list, I will have, let's say, 3 items, 1, 2, 3. So basically we have list 1 in which we have this first item, which is basically a list. And now let's say we will have another item, and this will also be a list. So let's say it will be 4, 5, and 6. And then we will have another item, and that will again be a list. So I will say 7, 8, and 9. Alright, so in here I am basically creating a list and I'm naming it as list 1, and now inside this list 1 I have 3 items. This one, and then this one, and then this one. Now let's say that if you want to print out this whole list, so you will just simply type print and then a list 1. So if you just execute this whole code, you will basically see this whole list printed out on the console screen in which we have 3 items, 1, 2, and then 3. But all of these items are basically a list. So in here, basically you can say that this is basically row 1, this is row 2, and then this is row 3, and then and then we have the first column, which is 1, 4, and 7, and then we have the second column in which we have item, let's say 2, 4, and 8, and then we have the third column, 3, 6, and 9. Now let's say that you want to access, let's say, this item, this value inside this list. So what I'm going to do is that first of all I need to specify the index number of this item. Basically we want a value inside this item basically. So this item is at index number 1. So first of all I'm going to specify here 1. Now we are basically inside this item. Now inside that item I want this value. So again it is basically storing that values from index number 0. So basically this item is at index number 0, and then this item is at index number 1. So I'm going to put here another bracket here, and I will say that 1 here, and I will just type here 1, the index number of that item that I want to access. So let's say if I just want to access this item, basically inside this item, then I need to specify here 2, because for this index, for this item is at index number 2. So now if you just execute this whole code, it's gonna print out 6 on the console screen. Alright, so you can see that it has accessed this item, and we are then printing out that item on the console screen. Now let's say that you want to access this item. So first of all what you're gonna do is that you just first of all have to access this whole item. So this item is at index number 0, and then 1, and then 2. So this item is at index number 2. So let's specify here 2, and now inside that item you want to access this item, which is again stored by their index number. So it is 0, 1, and 2. So in here first of all I need to specify 2, or let's say that I want to access this item which is at index number 1. So just specify here 1, and let's execute this whole code, and it's gonna print out 8 on the console screen, which is basically this item. Alright, now let's say that you want to print out each and every item inside these items. So for this we have to use the nested if statement. So first of all, as I told you that these are basically, you can consider them as rows, that is this item, and then this item, and then this item, while you can consider these item 1, 4, and 7 as the first column, and then these item 2, 5, 8 in the second column, and so on. So what you're going to do is that first of all you need to access these rows, these items basically, first item, second item, the third item that we have inside list 1. So what I'm going to do is that I will just type for row, I will just name this variable as a row, because we are basically accessing the rows using this for loop. So let's say that for a row in list 1, well, I can now just simply say print out row, and it's gonna print out basically these 3 items right here on the console screen. You can see that we have these items printed out on the console screen. Now let's say that you want to access items in this list as well. So for this, you need to have another for loop which can also go through these items, that is 1 2 3 and then 4 5 6. So basically these are the columns that we want to access. So I will say that for column, basically inside this row, because we are talking about these rows, and now we want to print out the columns as well. So I will say that for column in row, I'm gonna print out this time the column. And now what it will do is that it will print out each and every item that we have inside this list. That is the list which is inside this list. Alright, so I hope it is making sense. So let me just explain it one last time, because I know it might be very tough if you are completely new to computer programming. Alright, so first of all, what I'm doing is that I'm just going through each of these items and I'm just considering these items as rows. So I just name my variable, this variable as row, and I will say that go through each item in my list 1. And then since I need to go through each item in these rows as well, so I will say that for column in these rows, basically, because rows are basically all of these items that are inside this list. So what it will do is that it will just go through, first of all, the row is basically equal to this thing. So it's gonna go through all of these columns, that is 1 and then the second column and then the third column and then the third column. And then similarly, when the row is equal to basically this thing, then you're gonna go through each of these items inside that row, which is basically this column, and then this column. And then similar is the case with this thing as well. So now if you just execute this whole code, it will just print out each and every item printed out on the console screen. You can see that we have each and every item printed out on the console screen. So again, I hope it is making sense, but if not, then make sure that you go through this video 1 or maybe 2 or maybe 10 times in order to understand it. But finally, I'm telling you that you will understand it. So this is how we can use a nested for loop to access a list inside another list. So yeah, that's it for the nested loop example as well. Okay, now let's talk about one of the most difficult topic of all the programming languages, called errors. Now errors are very common in any programming language and can be very frustrating at times. So in this part, I'm going to be talking about different types of error that you may encounter in your program. So in Python, there are only 2 types of errors. Number 1 is the syntax error, and number 2 are the exceptions. So the syntax error is the one which is very common and even an expert cannot avoid it. And it occurs when your Python code is not according to Python rules and semantics, or Python is unfamiliar with what you are typing. Like for example, you may forget to add a comma or maybe colon or bracket, or you may be misspelling a keyword or wrong indentation, or you are just for example leaving some block completely empty, because you cannot leave a block completely empty. You have to use this keyword pass if you want to leave any block completely empty, or Python will consider it as an error. So now let's talk about different syntax error in Python. So let's say that I will have a function and I will name this function as, let's say, func, which stands for function. And now let's say that I do not put this colon. Now in order to tell Python that I'm going to start this function, we need this colon. But let's say that I just forget to add this colon, and without this colon I just enter inside the body of this function, and I'll just say that print this is a function. Alright, so now if we just try to execute this whole code, let's see what I will see on the console screen. Alright, so let's make it a little smaller. Alright, so Python is telling us that it is basically a syntax error because you are using an invalid syntax, and then Python is trying its best to locate that error and tell the user where you are basically doing that mistake. So first of all, it is telling that basically you are making this mistake right here in this file, which is inside your C drive, and then inside this folder Python tutorials, and then inside this file python crash course.py, and then it is telling that inside that file you are making that error in line number 2, and we know that we are making this error on line number 2, and then it is telling you exactly where you are making this error by having this a cap symbol, which is basically pointing somewhere right here, means that we are doing some error somewhere right here. So now when I see it, so you can see that in here Python is also telling me that it is basically expecting a colon here. So if you can just see here, see that right here down my cursor. So in here we just need to add this colon, and now our error will be gone and it will print out this thing on the console screen. Alright, now let's say that we will have another type of error, and that is, let's say, oops, we need to call this function as well. So just make sure that you call this function, and now if you just execute this whole code, it's gonna print out this thing on the console screen. Alright, now let's say that I just misspelled that basically this statement, this print statement, and instead of typing print, I will just type here print. Alright, so now if you just execute this code, let's see what I will see on the console screen. Alright, so again Python is telling me that your error is basically in line number 3 inside this file, and then it is basically inside this function that I named as func, and I was telling you that the error is somewhere right here, and then it's telling you that it's basically kind of, because in Python different errors have different names. So in here it is saying that it is basically the name error, and then it is saying that the name paint is not defined, because it is saying that it does not know anything about the statement paint, because we are misspelling it, so Python does not know what you are talking about. So now we know that from this amazing Python console screen, that this error is basically on line number 3 inside this function, and then the error is somewhere right here in which we are using this name paint, and then it is telling you the name of that error, and that error in Python is known as name error. So in here we now will use this thing, and now it will work absolutely fine. Alright, now let's say that in here I will just use, basically I'm using this opening quotation mark, but let's say that I forgot to add the closing quotation mark. And now if you just execute this whole code, let's see what I will see on the console screen. Alright, so again Python is saying that it is basically the error is on line number 3, and then in here it is again pointing you this arrow cap, and it's telling you exactly where the error is. So the arrow is pointing somewhere right here, so it is saying that it is just trying to execute this line of code, basically this string literal, because it is a string. So it is saying that it is trying to execute this string literal, but it is encountering some kind of error right here, somewhere right here. So now just by looking at it, we know that it is basically a syntax error, so we will correct it by adding this closing quotation mark as well. Alright, now finally let's say that I will just do not use this closing parenthesis, and now if you just execute this whole code, let's see what I will see on the console screen. So again it is saying that it is basically a syntax error, and then it is saying that it is basically inside this function, that the error is right here somewhere inside this function. So now just by looking at it, we know that we are just missing this closing parenthesis. So now if you just execute this whole code, it will now work fine. So these are some of the very common examples of a syntax error. And now let me explain what exceptions are, which is basically the second type of errors in Python. Now exception are types of error that occurs while your program is in the running state. So there are many types of exceptions that may occur, but for now I'm going to talk about only three types of exception. The first one is the zero division error, and it occurs when we try to divide 1 by any integer value. So for example, in here, if I will just say that let's say some integer value, and that will be, let's say, 1 divided by 0, and now if it is, now you can see that there is no syntax error. We are doing everything good. We have this colon, and then we have this closing parenthesis, and then we have the spelling of the print statement is absolutely correct, and then we are calling this function correctly as well. So nothing is wrong in this program. There is no syntax error, but basically there is. So Python will come to know about this error when it will basically execute this program. So let's execute this code, and let's see what we have on the console screen. So again Python is telling you that the error is basically on line number 3, and then the error is somewhere right here when you are printing and then trying to divide 1 by 0, and then it's saying that what is the name of the error. So it's saying that it's the zero division error, and what we are doing is that we are dividing some integer value by 0, because it is not possible to divide any value by 0. It is the mathematical error, so it's throwing you this error. Okay, now let's say that what I will do is that in here I will say that I will just add, let's say, a variable that is not defined, that is I have not declared that variable, and then let's say I will just try to add some value to it. So I'm just saying that a, and now remember, just notice that this variable is not defined. It does not has any value, but still I'm adding a +5 with it. So now let's see what what I will see on the console screen. Alright, so it is saying that basically it is the name error, and it's saying that it does not know anything about this variable a. So because it is not defined, we have not declared it anywhere in our code, because it does not know what this a is, whether it contains a string or integer value or a boolean value or something else. So it is saying that you must define this variable a in order to get rid of this error. So basically that error is in line number 3 inside this function, and basically the error is somewhere right here when we are printing this statement on the console screen. Alright, now let's say that I will have something like, I will just try to just concatenate basically a string with an integer value. So let's say that I will say that 5 plus let's say ABC. So remember that in Python we cannot add or perform or concatenate an integer with the string value. So let's execute this whole code and let's see what we have on the console screen. So first of all, it is saying that the type of error that we have is basically the type error, because it is saying that you are trying to basically add the integer or string value which is unsupported. So basically we cannot perform addition between string and integer value. That is very obvious, but what we can do is that we can put a string and an integer value together using this comma symbol. So now if you just execute this whole code, this time it will work fine, because this basically means that put this string with this integer. We are not adding it, we are just putting it together, this string and integer value. But we cannot perform the addition, or we cannot concatenate the string with an integer value. So these are basically some of the exceptions that I want to teach. Now in the coming videos we will cover more types of exceptions. So yeah, this is what errors and exceptions are. We have covered different types of syntax error, and then we have covered different types of exceptions in Python. Alright, so now you know what exceptions are, and then we discuss some exceptions that may occur. Now I'm gonna teach you how we can handle these exceptions. So for example, we ask the user to input an integer value, but let's say instead of writing an integer value, the user writes some string value. So now there should be some way so that we can tell the user that you are providing an invalid input and that you need to provide a correct value. So we can do this using the try and except block. So in here I will say that a try, and now what this try block will do is that it will first of all try to execute whatever it has inside it. So let's say that I will first of all take some input from the user, and let's say that I want to take some integer value from the user, and in here I will say that input, enter your age. Alright, so now once the user input is age, that age will be stored in this variable age, and let's say we'll check something else as well, and we will say that if age is less than or equal to 19, we're gonna print out this message saying that you are a teenager. Alright, so remember that for every try block, it must have an except block as well. Just like every else block, there must be an if as well. Similarly, for every try, it must have an except as well. So what it will do is that first of all, it will just try to execute whatever it has inside this try block. And now let's say that there is some kind of error inside that try block. That is, let's say that the user has specified an incorrect value for age. So let's say that he specify some string value. So now there should be some way that if there is some kind of error in these lines of code, basically in this block, then where it should go. So if there is some kind of error in that block, then it's gonna go inside the except block. So the except block is compulsory if we are using the try block. So remember that for this try block, we are using this except block outside this try block. And now in here I will say that except, and then put this column, and then enter inside the body of the except block. And then I'm going to print out the message. If there is some kind of error inside any of these lines of code, I'm going to print out this message. Let's say I will say that you are inputting an incorrect, or let's say we will just simply print out please input an integer value. Alright, now let me explain it one last time. So first of all, I'm asking the user to input his age, and that value will be stored in this variable age. So let's say that there is some kind of error while executing this line of code and the user specifies some incorrect value. So now what it will do is that it will stop the execution at that point, and then we'll just move directly inside this except log, and then we'll just simply print out this message. So now let's say that if the user specified the correct value, then it's gonna continue the execution inside this try block, and we'll just execute these remaining lines of code. And now let's say that all of these lines of code are successfully executed inside the try block, then it's gonna simply ignore the except log. The except log is, let's say, an exception that, let's say that if there is some kind of error inside this try block, then it's gonna execute this line of code, basically whatever it has inside the except log. So again, remember that for every try block we must have an except, and then for every except we must have a try block. So these are basically vice versa. So now let's execute this whole code. First of all, I need to specify any value of age. So let's say that I specified the correct value of age, and let's say I will say that the age is, let's say, 18 years. Alright, so it just prints out this message, you are a teenager, because in here I've specified that the age is less than 19, then it's gonna print out this message simply. Alright, now let's execute this whole code, and let's say that instead of inputting some integer value, I'm gonna input, let's say, some string value right here, and now if you just hit enter. Alright, so now that we are basically in here checking, so basically we are getting some kind of error right here, because we are not inputting, basically here, because we are not inputting an integer value, instead of we are inputting some string value. So we're gonna stop the execution at that point, and then for that try block it's gonna go to its except log. So the except log for this try block is right here, so we're gonna move the control of the program right here, and we'll just print out whatever we have inside the except log, and we'll just print out this message right here on the console screen. So I hope it is making sense. So now let's say that for this try block we do not have any except log, and now let's see what type of error that we have on the console screen, because I told you that for every try block we must have an except log as well. So it is saying that we have some kind of error in line number 8. Now we have nothing on line number 8, but it basically means that, basically you can see that this arrow is pointing towards nothing, means that in here it is expecting the except log. So in here we will just add this except log like this, and now we can execute this code successfully. So this is how we can error a simple exception in Python. Okay, now let's continue with handling exception in Python with a new example, in which we're gonna ask the user to input any two integer value, and then we're gonna divide both of these integer values. So first of all, I will have it in my try block. So I will just ask the user to input any two values. The first value will be stored in this variable a, and I will say that int input, and I will say that enter the first value, and then I will say that b equal to int input enter the second value. Alright, now I will just print out the result. If the user has successfully inputted both the values correctly, I'm gonna print out the result by dividing both of them. So I will say that print let's say result equal to a divided by b, or if let's say there is some kind of exception, then we can move to this except log, and then we'll just print out the error message. But I want to teach you something else. Now there are basically two types of error that may occur. The first one is basically the user may provide an invalid value, that the user, instead of specifying an integer value, he may specify a string value. So if the user specifies an incorrect value, then that error in Python is known as the value error. So in here we are telling that we will tell Python that if you encounter the value error, so we'll say that except and then the name of that error that may occur. So let's say that if the user inputs some invalid value, then it will be the value error, and then we will just tell the user that this is the value error, and then we will say that you need to provide both integer values. Alright, so now let's say, and then there might be another type of error that may occur, and that is, let's say that the user specifies some integer value for a, but then for B he specifies 0. So any integer value divided by 0 is basically the zero division error in Python that I've shown you in the previous video as well. So again, we will say that except. Now remember that a try block can have multiple except block like this if we are just specifying the error name, because there might be different kinds of error that may occur. So we're gonna tell the name of that error and then what you exactly need for that error. So the second type of error that may occur is basically the zero division error. So if that is the case, then we're gonna say that this is the zero division error, and then we will just specify some extra information telling the user that basically in here we'll say that you cannot divide an integer value by 0. So let's say that if there is some kind of value error, then it's gonna execute this block, and then if there is some kind of zero division error, then it's gonna execute this block. Or let's say if it is either not this one or this one, there might be like some like for example Python may be unable to execute this whole code, basically the code that is inside this block. So we're gonna say that then come inside this except block, and then we don't know what this error is, so we're gonna print out this message saying that unknown error has occurred, please try again. Alright, so in here what I'm doing is that first of all I'm just taking two inputs from the user, and if the user specify all the correct values for A and B, then we're gonna simply print out the result on the console screen. Or let's say that the user instead of specifying the integer value, specify let's say a string value for any of these variable, then it will be basically the value error. So it's gonna come inside this block. It knows that because in here we have specified that if you encounter the value error, then print out this message on the console screen. Or let's say that we specify an integer value for A, but for B we specify 0. So we know that 1 divided by 0 is basically the zero division error in Python. So I'm just telling Python that alright, so if just encounter this zero division error, then just print out this message on the console screen. Or let's say that if you don't know what type of error has occurred, then it's gonna come inside the except block, and we'll just simply print out this message on the console screen. Alright, so now let's execute this whole code, and first of all we'll make we'll just input the correct values for A and B. So let's execute this whole code. So first of all it is asking me to input the first value. So let's say that the first value is 12, and then the second value is let's say 6, and now if it just hit enter, it's gonna print out this result because there is no error while executing whatever we have inside the try block. So it will just simply ignore the except block, all the except block for this try block. Remember, only for this try block. Alright, so now let's execute this whole code again, and this time we will make value error. And now value error occur if we will just specify instead of some integer value some string value for any of these variable. So let's execute this whole code, and now let's say that the first value I will specify is correctly, but the second for the second value I will just specify some string value. And now let's execute this whole code. So it basically executed this line of code because it knows that it is the value error, and I have specified that if you encounter the value error, just simply prints out whatever you have inside this block. Alright, now let's make the zero division error as well. So let's execute this whole code. So let's say that for the first integer we will specify some integer value, and that will be let's say 5, and then for the second integer value we will specify 0. So now if we just execute this whole code, so it is saying that this is the zero division error, you cannot divide an integer value by 0. Now I don't know how to basically execute this line of code, but we can execute it by getting rid of basically this line of code, and then we'll make the zero division error. So in here let's get rid of this line of code. So first of all it will check if the error that has occurred is the value error or not. If it is not, then it will come inside the except block, and it will say that it does not know anything about this error. So let's execute this whole code, and in here let me just make it a little bigger. So for the first value I will specify 5, and then for the second value I will specify 0. So now if you just execute this whole code, first of all it checks if the error that has occurred is the value error or not. If it is not, then it just simply come inside the except block and prints out this message on the console screen. But basically this whole thing is actually the real code for this example. So I hope the try and except block is now making more sense, and now you should be getting some idea of how you can use it in your future programs. Okay, now I'm gonna talk about the else block in exception handling. So first of all, let's have an example, and then it will be a lot easier for me to explain it. So let's say that as usual, we're gonna just try to, let's say, take an age as an input from the user. So I'll say the age equal to int and then input, and then I will say that enter your age, and then in here I will check that if there is some kind of a value error or not. So I'll say that except value error, and I'm gonna say that print this is not an integer value, and then I will say that else print out you are age years old. Okay, now what I'm doing is that first of all I'm just taking some input from the user, and now let's say that once the user supplied that input, then our program will check if there is some kind of value error or not. If there is some kind of value error, then it's gonna print out this message, or else it's gonna print out this message. So what our program is doing is that first of all it is checking for value error after executing this line of code, basically checking this line of code. So after checking this line of code, it's gonna check that if we have some kind of value error or not. If there is some kind of value error, it's gonna execute this line of code, or else it's gonna print out this line of code. Now inside this else block, we will have another if. We will have an if statement, let's say. So we'll say that if age is less than or equal to, let's say, 35 years, we're gonna print out you are young enough to play football, or else we will say that print you are not young enough to play football. Alright, so basically this else is basically different from this else. So basically this else is the part of the if statement, and then this else is basically the part of this try block. So I hope it is making sense. So basically what I'm doing is that one last time is that first of all basically I'm checking this thing, basically this line of code, and then I'm checking if there is some kind of value error, then prints out this message, or else print out, basically execute whatever we have inside the else block. So the else block can be as long as you want, but we just put like few lines of code just to make it look simpler. So in here I'm checking that you are that much years old, and if that age is less than 35 years, then you are print out this message, or else print out this message. So now let's execute this code and it will make sense. So just execute this whole code, and first of all it will ask the user to input your age. So let's say that we will supply some let's say valid value first of all, and we will say that age is 23 years. And first of all it basically prints out this message, and then since our age is less than 35 years, so it also print out this statement. So again this else is basically the part of this if statement, and then this else is basically the part of our exception handling statement known as the try block. So this is how the else block works in Python. Alright guys, now I'm gonna talk about the finally clause in exception handling. Now finally clause is basically the final message that you want to give to the user, but whatever we have inside the finally block is always displayed to the user, and it is always displayed at the end. So let's say that this time I'm gonna try a new example, and I will say that try. So first of all I will say that we have player 1 experience, and we'll put it equal to an integer, and then we will basically ask that the first player to enter his football experience. So enter your football experience, and then I'm gonna ask player 2 as well. So let's name it as player 1, and then we're gonna name it 2 as player 2, and then I'm gonna put it equal to integer, and let's say input, and then enter your football experience. Alright, so now we are basically first of all asking the user to input their experiences, and now I will check if there is some kind of value error or not. So I'll say that except value error, and I'm going to print out you need to supply the experience in numbers, or else we're gonna basically come inside the else block, and we will say that if player 1 experience is greater than player 2 experience, then we're gonna print out a message saying that player 1 has more football experience than player 2, or else we're gonna say that print player 2 has more football experience than player 2. Well, let's add an elif here as well. So let's type here elif, and we'll say that if player 1 experience is equal to the player, oops, where is my cursor? Right here. Alright, so player 2 experience, oops, basically we need to have this thing right here. Alright, so basically not even here, right here. I can't code well today. Alright, so in here we are checking if both have the same experience. Then we're gonna print out a message saying that both players have the same experience. So now we're gonna just finally say that we're gonna add this finally clause right here at the end, and we'll say that finally, thank you so much for providing your information. So alright, so what I'm doing is that first of all I'm checking both of these conditions, and if it's successfully, and then after checking both of these conditions, I'm checking if there is some kind of value error or not. If there is some kind of value error, then it will print out this thing on the console screen, and will then skip this else part. But even then it will execute basically this finally block, and still it will print out this message. But if there is no value error, then it will basically execute whatever we have inside this else block, and then it will still execute whatever we have inside the finally block. So the finally block will execute whether we have an exception or not. It doesn't care about the exception. It will execute whether we have an exception or not. So let's execute this whole code. So let's execute this whole code. First of all, we need to supply the player 1 experience and then the player 2 experience. So first of all, in here we will supply player 1 experience. So let's say that the player 1 experience is, let's say, 12 years, and then player 2 experience is, let's say, 11 years. Alright, so it just prints out this message, player 1 has more experience than player 2, and then finally it prints out whatever we have inside the finally block, that thank you so much for providing your information. But if there is, let's say, some kind of error while executing, let's say in here we just provide a valid value, but for player 2 we just provide, let's say, a string value, then it's gonna print out that it is saying that you need to supply the experience in numbers, and then still it is just executing whatever we have inside the finally block by printing out this message on the console screen. Now I want to teach you about something else as well. Now let's say that the user supplies some invalid values, let's say here, or like it is supplying an invalid value right here. Now instead of just printing out this message right here, it should again ask the user to input player 1 and player 2 experience again, because previously we were supplying invalid values, but now he should, so basically our program should keep on asking the user again and again until he supplies the correct value. So for this, what we can do is that basically we can put this whole code right here that we have inside the while block. So basically you know that the while loop basically execute a specific portion of a code again and again. So what we will do is that we will basically execute this whole code again and again until the user provide a valid value for player 1 and player 2 experience. So for this, what I'm going to do is that I will just put this whole code. Basically we want to execute this whole code again and again until the user supplied the correct values for the football experience. So in here, I'm going to put this whole code inside the while block, and I will say that, well, let me just put it down, and I will say that while 1. And now what does this 1 here means? Well, instead of 1, we can also type here true, but most people type 1 here. So this 1 basically means while true, and you know that the loop always execute as long as the condition inside it is true. So this loop will always execute as long as this condition is true. So now the question is where this loop will end. So first of all, let me just put inside this whole thing inside the while loop by indenting it properly. So I'm gonna press tab on my keyboard, and it will basically indentate this whole code will basically indentate inside this while loop. And the question here is, when will this loop stop? So first of all, we are supplying the correct values right here and then right here. So in here, basically, once we execute this else block, which means that the user has supplied the correct values. So that is why it has entered the else block. Now remember, in this video, I talked about the break statement, and now the break statement is basically used to take the program control out of the for loop. So right here, once our program enter inside the else block, we can then break it. Or let's say that when our program enters inside the finally block, we're gonna break it. So right here, I will just use this statement break. Now what I'm doing here, so first of all, I'm checking if the user will supply a correct value or not. If there is some kind of value error, then I will not break this program, because it will not go inside the else block. It will basically print out this message, you need to supply the experience in numbers. So it will again come here inside this while loop, because the while loop is used to execute a specific portion of code as long as the condition inside is true. So again, this condition will be true for the second loop as well. Well, this condition will always be true as long as we do not break this loop. So right here, it will again ask the user to input your football experience, and then ask player 2 to enter the football experience. So let's say that this time he will provide the correct experience. So first of all, it will check for value error. If there is no value error, then it's gonna come inside the else block and will execute whatever we have inside the else block, and then finally it will just come inside the finally block and will print out this message, and then we are using this break statement. And now what this break statement will do is that it will take the program control outside the loop. So now let's execute this whole code, and it will then make more sense. Alright, now let's say that first of all I will provide the correct values for, let's say, player 1, but invalid value for the second player. And now if it is hit enter, it's gonna, let's say, oops. Alright, so again it is coming basically inside the finally block, because I told you that even if we have an error, it will still come inside the finally block. So basically we need to use this break statement right here. Alright, so now if you just execute this whole code, And first of all, I need to supply the football experience of the first player, and then the football experience of, let's say, the second player, in basically string, basically, which is an invalid value. And now if you just hit enter, all right. So again, it is saying that enter your football experience. So let's say that this time I will just provide the correct information. So player 1, and then let's say for player 2 it is 13, and now it is saying that player 2 has more football experience than player 2, and then finally it prints out this message. And then since our program was somewhere right here, so it just see that statement break, so it just took the program control out of the while loop, and this is how we can basically put the whole code inside the while loop. So I hope that this example was interesting to you guys, and I hope that now the while loop and the break statement is making more sense than it was before. Okay, now in this final part of exception handling, I'm going to show you how you can raise your own exception. So let's say you expect the user to enter any positive value, but the user inputs a negative value. Now in Python, this is not any type of exception, but you can call it an exception by raising an exception by yourself. So let's have an example of it. So first of all, I will just ask the user to input any positive value. So I'll say that int and then input, and then I will ask the user to enter any positive value, to enter any positive value. And now in here I will check that if x is less than 0, means that if the value of x is basically a negative value, then basically raise an exception. So we basically use this keyword raise to raise an exception. So let's type here raise, and then we will use this built-in basically a class in Python known as exception. Now we haven't covered what basically classes and objects are, but just for now assume that this a class is something which basically contain information about something. So basically this class exception contain information about how to raise an exception. So we'll say that raise exception, and now in these parentheses we will say that what type of exception it is. So we will say that expecting a positive value, but instead got a negative value, or else we will just simply print out this value x. So if the user is supplying some negative value, then we're going to basically raise an exception, and this exception will be basically this thing, in which we will print out this message. Or else if the value is a positive number, then it's going to come inside the else block, and we'll just simply print out this number, that positive number. So let's execute this whole code. So first of all, we'll just supply some negative value. So it is basically expecting a positive value. So let's say that I supply some negative value, like for example negative 23, and now we just execute this whole code. So it is saying that raise an exception. So basically now the exception is expecting a positive value, but instead got a negative value, and this is basically this thing that we have right here on the console screen. So it is now basically an exception, and we basically raised it by ourselves. So well, we can basically call this exception as the value error as well, because we are expecting a positive value, but the user is not giving a positive value. He's basically giving a negative value. So we can call it as a negative exception by raising the value error exception. Now in Python, negative value is basically not a value error, but we can call it as a value error by raising the value error exception. So let's do it. So for this, what I'm going to do is that I will just put basically this thing inside the try block. Basically this thing, this thing inside the try block. And now let's get rid of this thing right here. And now in here, if x is less than 0, we're going to basically raise the value error. So in here I'm saying that if x is less than 0, then we will raise the value error. Although we know that in Python by built-in, by default it is not the value error, because a negative value is not a value error, but still we are raising a value error. And now in here inside the else block, once we have raised the value error, we will say that except if there is some kind of value error, then we're going to come inside the except block, and we will print out you need to supply a positive integer value. Alright, so first of all, I'm checking that if the value that the user has supplied is a positive number or negative number. If it is a negative number, then I'm saying that it raise the value error right here, and then in here, since we have raised a value error, then in here it will check if this is a value error or not. Well, it is now a value error because we have raised it right here, so it's gonna come inside the expect block and just will print out this statement on the console screen. Alright, so now let's execute this whole code, and now let's say that we will print out in here we'll just supply a negative value, and let's say that it is a negative 21, and now if you just hit enter, so in here it is basically executing whatever we have inside the expect block, because in here we have raised a value error by saying that if the value is less than 0, means that if it is a negative number, then raised that value error, so it basically execute whatever we have inside the except block and just print out this message on the console screen. Now similarly, you can raise any type of built-in error right here. Like for example, in here, let's say that we will just name it as a zero division error. Although it's not a zero division error, but let's assume that, let's call it a zero division error. And now in here, I will just supply here zero division error, and I will say that you need to supply a positive value, or I will say that this is a zero division error. Although we know that this is not a zero division error, but let's say that for fun we are saying that this is the zero division error. So now let's execute this whole code and by supplying first of all the negative value. So let's say it is -9, and if I just hit enter, so it is saying that this is the zero division error. So this is how we can raise our own exception in Python. So that's all for error and exception. We have covered a lot about error and exception, so I hope that you now know how to handle different types of exceptions in Python. Now, while making real-time applications in Python, we often require to read some data from external files, or maybe write data to some external files. So from now on, we're gonna start working on files. So I have a file in my project location. So right here in my project location, which is Python tutorials, I have a file named football_players.txt. So I'm gonna open this file. So in this file I have the name of the 3 best footballers, that is Messi, Ronaldo and Modric, and then the total number of goals they have scored in the last season. Like for example, Messi has scored 11 goals, Ronaldo in the last season has scored 9 goals, and then Modric has scored 7 goals in the last season. So first of all, I will teach you how to read from this file, which is basically the external file. So right here in this file, python crashcourse.py, I'm gonna first of all open this file. So I will just use a built-in function in Python to open this file, and this function is known as open. So the first parameter it takes is basically the name of the file that we want to open, and then the mode of that file. Well, I'm gonna tell you what this mode is, but first of all we need to specify right here in this double quotation mark the name of that file that we want to read. Now since my file is placed in my project location, so I can directly access it with its name, that is football_players.txt. But in your case, if that file is not placed in your project location, then you need to specify the exact location of that file where it is placed on your computer. Like for example, if it is placed in C drive, then you just type C, and then let's say a folder name like this, files, and then the name of that file, let's say. But since it is placed in my project location, so I can just directly access it with its name, which is football_players, and then the extension of the extension of it is .txt. Alright, now for the mod, since we want to read that file, so we will specify here R, and this basically tells Python that I want to read something from this txt file after opening it. Now another thing we can use here is basically W, which means that we want to write something in this file. Now another thing that we can use here is basically this A, and this basically means that we want to append something in this file. Now append basically means that we want to add some record or maybe some text at the end of this file. And then similarly, what we can use is what else we can use is basically R plus, and this basically provides you the ability to both read and write data to this file, which is basically in my case this file, after opening this file. So now basically for now we just want to read something from this file. I will just specify here R. So basically, first of all, I'm just opening my file, and then I'm telling Python that after you open it, I will just read something from this file. Alright, so now this open function will basically open that file. So now let's say that we will store that open file basically in a variable, and we will name this variable as, let's say, file underscore name. So again, you can name it anything you want. And now once we have this file open, now remember to close it as well after you have read something from that file. Now we haven't read anything from this file, but just to make sure that we have closed that file after reading something from this file, so in here I will just specify first of all the name of the variable in which we have stored that file. So I will just type here file underscore name, and then we use the close function to close that file. So make sure that once you open the file, then make sure that you close it as well. Alright, now let's read something from this file. But first of all, I will just make sure that my file is in the readable mode. So for this, I will just specify here, let's say print, and now in here I will say that file name dot readable. And now this readable function basically return either true or false. It returns true if our file, which is basically this file, is in the read mode, or else it will return false if our file is not in the reading mode. So basically this function will make sure that basically this line has executed successfully. Alright, so now if you just execute this whole code to see what output we will get on the console screen. Okay, so it is saying true. It means that our file is in the readable form, and now we can read something from this file. Now the most simplest thing that you can do with it is basically to basically print out each and everything in this file. So for this, instead of using the readable function, well, let's say that if you have, let's say, W here, means that if your file is in the write mode, and now if you just execute this whole code, it will now this time return false because our file is not in the readable mode. It is basically in the writable mode. So just type here R, and now we will just first of all print out whatever content we have inside this file, and for this we will use a built-in function in Python known as read. So I'm basically reading whatever I have inside this open file underscore name. So now if you just execute this whole code, you will see each and everything basically in that file printed out right here on the console screen. Now let's say that you want to read let's say only one line from the file. So for this, instead of using this read function, we're gonna use a function called readLine, and this will basically read by default the first line, first of all the first line in our file. So now if you just execute this whole code, it will read the first file, which is basically this thing right here in our file, which is basically the score, the number of goals that are scored by Messi. Now in here, what basically it does is that it first of all read that first line and then move the cursor to the second line. So now if I just basically use this statement once again, so now if you just execute this whole code, this time it will just print out first of all this line, and then it just prints out the second line on the console screen. So now if you just want to print out the third line, so basically this readLine function basically prints the current line and then move the cursor to the next line. So the next time if you use this function, it's gonna print out the second line, and the third time if you use this function, it's gonna print out the third line. So now if you just execute this whole code, this time it will also print out the third line on the console screen as well. But instead of using this function readLine, what we can do is that instead of using readLine again and again, the other function that we can use is known as readLines. And what it do is that it basically prints out each line that we have in our file in a list, and then prints out that list on our console screen. So now if you just execute this whole code, you will basically see a list which contain each and every line of that file. Like for example, this is the first line, and then this is the second line, and then finally this is the third line. So now with it, since we now have this list, we can now access each line by its index number. Like for example, this line is at index number 0, this one is at index number 1, and then this one is at index number 2. So let's say that you want to read, let's say index number 1. So in here, you can just specify the index number of that line that you want to read. And now if you just execute this whole code, this time it will only basically prints out the second line, which is at index number 1 on the console screen. Now what we can do is that we can also print out all the lines using the for loop. So in here, I will say that for, so basically after opening this file, we can use the for loop. So I'll just type here for, let's say player in file name. We're gonna basically, so file name dot read lines, and now we will say that print basically all the players. So just type here player, and now this will basically print out each and everything on our console screen, just like this. This is how we can basically read content from a file. Now we will see how we can write and append some content inside that file. Okay, now I want to talk about writing something to a file. So let's say that you want to append something to a file, and by appending I means that we want to insert something right at the end of a file. So for this we need to set the mode of our file to A, which basically stands for append. And now since our file is in the appended mode, we can now write inside this file. So previously our file was in the reading mode, so we were not able to write something to that file. But now since we have this mode set to A, now we can write something to a file. So I will say that file name, and now since we want to write something to a file, so we'll use a built-in function in Python known as write. And now inside this double quotation mark, we can write anything to that file. So let's say that we will store the record of another great footballer, and his name is Kane. He's basically an English footballer, and let's say that the number of goals he has scored in the last season is, let's say, 6. So now if you just execute this whole code, you will see Kane this time in this file as well. So I have this file name football_play.txt. I will just open it, and you will see basically his name right at the end of this file. Now the problem here is that it is basically putting this thing right after this last record. Now if you want to make this thing to the next line, what you can do is that in here you can use a special character \n, and this will make sure that this record will go to the next line. So this is basically a special character, and this basically makes sure it just takes the cursor to the next line before it just prints out this thing, before it just write this thing out to the file. So now previously it was right here, but now we will have this thing basically in here. We will just remove it from here, and now if we just execute this whole code, and let's execute it. Okay, so now you will see Kane printed out right here in this file. Now let's say that you want to let's say that you will set the mode to W, which means that we want to write something to a file. Now the difference between write and append is that append basically insert the record at the end of the file, while the write basically overwrites that file. So in here, now if we just let's say store something else, like for example the name of a female footballer, her name is Kelly, and let's say that she scored 9 goals in the last season. So now what it will do is that it will basically overwrite this whole file and will only put this thing inside this file. So now if we just execute this code, alright, so it has been executed successfully. And now if we just show you this file, it is we are only able to see this thing in our file because the write function basically overrides whatever we have inside that file. Now another few things that I want to teach is, let's say that you want to create a file. So let's say in here you will just write something to that file. So let's say instead of Kelly, we will just write the name of another female footballer, Taylor. And now let's say that we want to create a file. So first of all, this open function checks that if that file is present in that location or not. If that file is not present in that location, it will basically create a file with that name, and then we'll write this thing to that file. So let's say that we will create a new file, and let's say this time we will name it as football.txt. Just notice here that inside this project I don't have this file with this name, but now if we just execute this whole code, it will then create that file, and then we'll just write this thing to that file. So let's execute this code. So in here, okay, so you can see that it has been executed successfully, and now we have a file here, football.txt, that it created after executing this line of code. And now if you just open this file, football.txt, you will see this thing right here in this file. Now you can not only create a .txt file, but you can create HTML file as well. So let's create an HTML file, and we will name this HTML file as, let's say, Taylor, and then obviously the extension of it will be HTML. So now we can just write anything inside on this HTML file. Like for example, we will say that we will have an heading, so h1, and now the heading will be Taylor is my best friend, and now we'll just close this heading as well. So if you don't know what HTML is, so everything that you see on a web page is basically made up of an HTML. So like for example, this time we will have this is basically an heading tag. So this thing will basically appear in h1 tag, and h1 is basically, we'll just put that text in bigger font. So now if you just execute this whole code, let's execute it, and you will just see that it will just create a file of this name taylor.html. So now if you just open this file, you will see basically this thing on the console screen. Well, basically it is not rendering it, but if you just open this file inside a web page, you will see that this thing right here will be rendered, and you will see this tags in the heading form. So this is how we can create different types of files in Python, and this is how we can just write something to a file as well.